Ratchet and Clank is a long-running series of 3D platformers developed by Insomniac Games and released exclusively for PlayStation consoles. This month, the property has reached its 20th anniversary, and I'm embarking on my longest retrospective yet. It used to be my favourite franchise in all of gaming, and it's time to share my personal experiences with the titles. I don't own a PlayStation 5, so Rift Apart will have to wait. Instead, we'll be looking at all the mainline entries from the original through to the PS4 remake. A word of warning to those who suffer from epilepsy, as every game in the series features some very flashy effects. Let's begin. The platforming genre is often synonymous in the console market, with many mascots coming and going. The onset of the third dimension on the 5th generation of consoles led to substantial upgrades on the 6th. The PlayStation 2 had already been out for 2 years when Insomniac arrived on the platform, continuing their long-running partnership with Sony, which has recently turned into full ownership. Spyro the Dragon had been sold off to Activision, and it wouldn't be continuing under its original creator. The Burbank studio struck out with a new IP, one that would become synonymous with the PlayStation brand as their main platforming mascot. I was first introduced to Ratchet and Clank through an old schoolmate, who showed me the opening levels round his house. When compared to the basic releases I was playing on PS1, the series was a solid showcase for what the PlayStation 2 had to offer. At the time, I wasn't fully aware that it was the same developer who brought the Purple Dragon to the masses, but nevertheless I was fascinated by the title. After I got the PS2 for my 11th birthday, I completed my collection over time and still own the original copies to this day. Ratchet, a Lombax, is a simple mechanic who dreams of leaving the planet Veldin and exploring the universe. For one game only, he's voiced by Mikey Alley, adopting a rebellious persona. Clank, voiced by David Kay, is a glitch in a system of guard robots who discovers a deadly plot. Without dialogue from either character, the story establishes the key players and main story threads. Once the two have met, their opponent is brought in. Chairman Drek, the leader of the Blarg, is creating a new world for his species by ripping out parts of other planets. The first set of levels are an easygoing bunch, pulling the player into the blend of platforming and shooting. For the original game, the balance is placed firmly on the former, with around 60% jumping and 40% blasting. This is immediately apparent with the controls. Those who play modern action games may find them a bit stiff and imprecise, as Ratchet has to turn all the way round to face his opponents before targeting them. To make up for this, the protagonist has a range of moves from side flips to wall jumps, alongside tossing his wrench like a boomerang. Add to that the upgrades you get from Clank with the Helipack and Thruster Pack, and you've got a highly versatile moveset. Sometimes the camera turn speed can feel a little slow, but otherwise it avoids the pitfalls of lesser 3D platformers. On top of the core gameplay, the Gadgetron Help Desk delivers seamless tutorial messages while also tying in with the game world. It keeps the action moving while giving the player all they need to understand the mechanics. If you've been into gaming for a long time, you'll point out many magical moments that pulled you into the medium. Some might say riding out onto the Hyrule Fields in Ocarina of Time, or exploring the Halo Ring in Combat Evolved. For me, stepping out into Metropolis Kerwin was that moment. The size of the buildings, the flying vehicles all around you, and the sheer scale of the landscape. This was when my simple enjoyment of Ratchet and Clank became an obsession. From that point on, I was a mega fan of both the series and the sci-fi genre. When I was 9 or 10, I looked for any chance I could to play round friends' houses or after school clubs. A lot of this came down to the aesthetics. Ratchet and Clank features a mechanical looking future with a distinctive tone and feel for each world. It's the same template used on the original PlayStation, and the level design is varied and engaging all the way through. The game's animations are also stellar, with great expressions from the characters. The sense of personality is always top-notch from the moment you start playing. Veldin is a backwater planet, with simple browns placed against an uplifting soundtrack that represents Ratchet's home. By contrast, Blarg Station is isolated and creepy, with the ugly enemies leaning towards a scarier atmosphere. These environments are often introduced in the form of ironic infomercials that play on the infobot you collect to access each location. Captain Quark advertises Al's workshop with the smooth-talking nature of a slimy salesman, but when you visit the place in person, the result is less than impressive. This deceiving nature colours the entire adventure, with expectations butting against a lackluster reality. Sometimes this is used for humour, like the Blarg Lieutenant running in fear on planet Europa, but as you go on, it's used to convey the subtle feeling that the Solana galaxy isn't as enthralling as Ratchet believed. Moving past the initial wonder, the planets are a series of pathways that lead to intersecting objectives. Some are focused on platforming, and others feature a higher amount of combat. In the case of Metropolis, we have the fitness course to test your jumping skills for a swing shot, and in the other direction we have a straight shot towards both Clank's helipad and an info bot that opens the next location. What takes Ratchet and Clank a step beyond Spyro are the gadgets you'll need to traverse new areas. Early on for Planet Iridia, you'll find swing shot targets that require you to go to Metropolis, pick up an item, and then go back later. In turn, this leads you to the Trespasser, which introduces door puzzles while also being required for a story mission on planet Eudora. These connections are applied to other levels further down the line, alongside the secret gold bolts hidden away in nooks and crannies. The earliest of these is Skid McMarx and his agent. Acquiring a hoverboard here gets you into a race, and then winning said contest unlocks a special gadget from Skid's agent later on. Other paths are optional, like the one behind the landing pad on Novalis, which takes you to a gold bolt and some extra currency. On that note, let's talk about bolts. Right from the start, they have formed the franchise's economy. In the first game, you earn them by killing enemies and breaking open the many crates around the environments. Then you use them to purchase weapons and ammo. Saving for your next implement of death is delayed at many moments by story-specific payments, which keep you from having too many bolts too quickly. Much like money bags from Spyro 2 and 3, the world of Ratchet and Clank is filled with opportunities to make a buck, though this time it's done with multiple cast members who each have their own exaggerated characteristics and some comic relief. In this case, the bribes you pay are a key part of the narrative themes, as the main antagonist himself says,
"This is about one thing and one thing only, cash, and lots of it."
Everyone is out to swindle others, and this is emphasised early on. Helga makes the duo pay for the swing shot, Big Al highlights his service fee, and Quark's bouncer demands a payment, in advance. These roadblocks can have you returning later after some grinding, but if you're a diligent explorer, you won't need to go back and collect more bolts. Even if you do, there are multiple ways to earn them: killing enemies, using the metal detector, and racing around the hoverboard tracks a few times. Some sections include large stashes of bolts, which you can earn by beating a challenge or obtaining the correct item. Raiding the villain's personal vault on planet Quartu is the biggest example of this, offering a ton of bolts as a reward for making it through the Hydro tunnels on Drek's fleet. The same holds true for weapons. Ratchet and Clank was the very first game that showcased Insomniac's talent for making cool guns, and while many are basic in their function, you could already see the seeds being planted for future entries. The Glove of Doom summons mini-robots that tear through enemies, the Walloper lands a satisfying punch while conserving ammo, the Morpho Ray turns enemies into chickens, the Tesla Claw auto-targets foes for high damage, and my personal favourite, the Visibomb gun, launches a missile that you can guide to a target. Other weapons are mere novelties, most notably the Taunter, which is good for a cheap kill and breaking boxes, but not much else. Finally, there's the big one, the weapon to end all weapons, the RYNO, or Rip Ya a New One, sold for a whopping 150,000 bolts by a black market dealer. This missile launcher lays waste to everything, very much like Doom's BFG. This gun would also become a regular fixture throughout the series. No matter which armament you're using, the quick select menu is right at your fingertips, which keeps you from going through the menus constantly. When you reach Quark's training course on planet Umbris, the pathways narrow into a single gauntlet. Already the game is hinting at a major shift in the story. You fight your way through a trickier obstacle course, which includes getting revenge on the sharks who gave you trouble before, and finally make it to the quote-unquote Ring of Heroes. As an 8-year-old, the twist was shocking, but as an adult, you can see the betrayal coming from a mile away. It turns out that Quark is the biggest swindler of them all, only interested in his image and wealth rather than real heroics. With that, he leaves the duo at the first major boss fight, taking place in a wide arena with multiple attacks. The death of the Snaggle Beast marks the end of Act 1, and creates a ton of tension between our two leads. Clank's logic made him blind to the oncoming deception, and Ratchet's hopes of fame and adventure turn out to be a joke. This forms a back-and-forth conflict that's surprisingly engaging for such a simple storyline. On planet Battalia, we enter a war zone as Drek's army steps up its assault on the galaxy. In both tone and gameplay, things start to heat up as tougher enemies are thrown at you. The blaster isn't going to cut it for these tanks, so you'll turn to the Devastator, a powerful rocket launcher, to get the job done. Whether it's weapons, gadgets, or locations, Ratchet and Clank is always making full use of its tools to switch things up. The other gameplay styles include commanding robots as Clank, piloting a starfighter, traversing grind rails while dodging obstacles, 2 hoverboard tracks that follow on from Spyro-free skateboarding, smashing your way through enemies as Giant Clank, and even a stealth section involving a robot disguise. What all of these sections do is maintain the balance between platforming and shooting without disrupting the pace. For example, making Ratchet slower and unable to jump when disguised, which keeps the overall challenge consistent. On occasion, you'll also find a built-in set piece. Blackwater City is one of the more well-known locations from the series, and it features a claustrophobic escape from a rising flood. This bit always put me on edge back in the day. Watching Ratchet drown in the depths was very eerie to watch. Boss fights are also sprinkled across the game. They start off simple with a Mother Beast on Blarg Station, before escalating to the aforementioned Snaggle Beast and a space battle with Quark. Slowly but surely, they add a wider range of attacks and test your ability to dodge. Heading on to other planets, Auxon, the Blarg's polluted hellhole, is the biggest and most used planet with 2 full sections for both protagonists. At first, the planet is harsh and foreboding, the toxic air being too dangerous for Ratchet. Once you have the Magna Boots, you can return to Battalia and take down the warships in a turret sequence, but you don't have to. You can choose to push on through a more difficult area and collect the info bots for Pokitaru straight away. When you do reach that planet, it's a stark contrast with lush tropical waters surrounded by a holiday resort. Heading back to Auxon again with the O2 mask, the music changes to a tone of discovery, but the level still has its dangers with some tough enemies who are difficult to dodge. Trying to sneak past these snappers was always nerve-wracking to my younger self. Once you reach the planet Hoven, the duo strikes a major blow against Drek's operation, taking down the Planet Buster in a challenging turret sequence. Multitasking to shoot the autocannons while also dealing with the helicopters was always a tough section, but with enough perseverance you'll beat it and reach the end of Act 2, Gemlik Base. This was always one of my favourite levels in terms of atmosphere and tone. It's gloomy and ominous. You already know you'll be encountering Captain Quark on this mission, and it also features some crafty enemy placements on the turrets. You'll need to shoot the Devastator or Visibomb from tighter angles to succeed. Facing off against Quark is a great climax. Watching Ratchet swing his wrench at the villain with all his strength shows how angry he's been since Umbris. In another nod to Spyro, every planet has its own soundtrack that sets the tone. This same approach carries through to the rest of the series. Composer David Burgo does a brilliant job at making each track feel unique, while also adapting them to the various platforming challenges. Perhaps the most well-known is Battalia Grinding, which kicks in as you take on the side objective. Ratchet and Clank also nails replayability. In a time when games took about 6 hours to beat, the skill points and special golden weapons extend the runtime further. Exploration is highly encouraged, especially once you've beaten the game. The title keeps track of all your unlockables and achievements through the special menu, which appears when you enter challenge mode after beating the game. This brings us to the final levels. Ratchet and Clank were hopelessly naive in the first act and endlessly bickering in the second. In the third, they come back together for the final push, putting aside their faults to take down Chairman Drek with a sleek ship to boot. This is what makes the story of the original stand out, as they journey to the most challenging sequences. In Gorda City on the planet Altanus, Clank is forced to stay with the ship due to the lightning storms, and the insurance policy you had when making tight jumps is also taken away. It's certainly the most difficult and foreboding location in the entire game. After sneaking into the place where Clank was created and infiltrating Drek's fleet, we return to Veldin for the final showdown. The place is filled to burst with elite troopers, flying gunships and tanks, while also making use of every gadget you've acquired over the course of the game. It will take a lot of ammo to work your way through to the final battle with Drek, which has its own twist in the form of a countdown timer. The corrupt CEO is defeated, and his planet is destroyed by turning his own super laser against him. As the game ends, Ratchet and Clank stick together, their friendship fully solidified, yet this was only the beginning of their many adventures. The 2002 release was a huge hit for PlayStation, and Insomniac immediately got to work on the next game. From 2002 to 2003, the first Ratchet and Clank was the best game I'd ever experienced. That is, until I made a surprising discovery. I went over to another friend's house, and he whipped out a copy of Ratchet and Clank 2. Wait, there's another one? Yes, there was, and it was awesome. R&C 2, or Going Commando in the US, is an A+ sequel, bringing in tons of new ideas and expanding the series further. The fact that Insomniac were able to put it together in 1 year speaks volumes of their talents. Where Metropolis Kerwin pulled me in, the B2 Brawler showed me how ambitious a sequel could be. Seeing this mechanised monstrosity towering over Ratchet really emphasised the upgrades from the original. Playing it today, what sticks out to me are all the elements that were introduced but never returned in future entries. Shortly after the events of the first game, Ratchet and Clank are sitting around on Veldin, their fame having cooled off after defeating the Blarg. All of a sudden, the two are hired by the grammatically challenged Abercrombie Fizzwidget, CEO of Megacorp in the Bogon Galaxy. The protagonists are very tempted by the high pay position and fringe benefits. Ratchet suits up and heads out to recover the experiment from an elusive thief, while Clank takes up some accounting work in Metropolis and Daco. From the start, you'll see that Ratchet's voice actor has changed to James Arnold Taylor, who still portrays the character to this day. His rebellious side has been dropped in favour of a more by-the-book attitude. This persona would stay in place until the start of the future trilogy on PS3. Starting off with Ratchet on his own, we infiltrate a flying cruiser on planet Uranus and blast some robots with the two starting weapons, the rapid-fire Lancer and the explosive gravity bomb. The gameplay remains mostly unchanged, except for one key addition, strafing. Hold down the shoulder buttons and Ratchet will stay pointed at whatever he's aiming at. This one change shifts the series away from platforming and more towards shooting, something that would only continue in later entries. The split is around 60% shooting and 40% jumping, and the game wastes no time pulling you back into the mix. As early as the second level, you're taking on the first boss fight, and right after that, you're testing out a new gadget. Ratchet and Clank 2 doesn't beat around the bush with the same simple cutscenes from before. Instead of infobots, you have these TV screens that upload the coordinates for new planets. The focus on satire remains intact, but the second game leans more towards corporate oversight and espionage. Tongue-in-cheek commercials clash with confidential behind-the-scenes footage from the Megacorp labs, showing that the company has more than a few skeletons in their closet. Aside from the addition of strafing, where Ratchet and Clank 2 really made its mark was the expansion. Space battles, hoverbike racing, arena combat, crystal hunting, spherical worlds, armoured suits, hacking minigames, weapon and health upgrades. That's a lot of new features for a sequel, and every one of them adds to the core action. We have the return of older gadgets like the swing shot and grind boots, alongside upgrades to others. The Magna boots have been replaced with the gravity boots for more flexible movement on walls and ceilings, and other tools like the glider boost the gameplay scenarios even further. The Clank sections, while brief, feature bridge bots and hammer bots who can articulate themselves more so than the regular infantry. Giant Clank is also much more intuitive, leaping high above enemies in low gravity and firing off his weapons more smoothly. Everything that made the first game so enjoyable is here and accounted for, even if it sometimes ditches the more open nature of its predecessor. Backtracking can take you to some secret areas, like this hidden boss on planet Oozla by going up the grav ramp. The health and weapon upgrades are easily the most important change, as they alter the overall flow. Earning more health over time is balanced out by the enemies doing greater damage as you play. One small enemy taking a bite will deplete one unit, but getting hit by a large slow-moving projectile will be more painful. As you crank up the nanotech bar, a risk-reward element also comes into play. If you take down enough enemies and fill up the experience bar, Ratchet's health will be automatically refilled while triggering an explosion that wipes out all enemies close to him. This encourages you to be more aggressive, powering your way through and further emphasizing the shift towards third-person shooter gameplay. At the same time though, you'll have to watch the ammo count. With no PDA to deliver supplies remotely, the Megacorp vendors are vital for your success. Less important, but just as tempting, are the weapon modifications. Ratchet stumbles across the black market dealer Slim Cognito, who offers acid, shock and lock-on upgrades in exchange for platinum bolts. These items aren't necessary for finishing the game, but they continue to reward exploration with a handy set of add-ons. The roster of firearms has expanded and then some, with more powerful toys to play around with and upgrade by killing enemies. Gradually filling up weapon experience bars and testing out a new special ability is one of the most rewarding parts of the game, something that would persist through the rest of the series. Fan favourites like the Bouncer and Blitzgun had their first appearance, and Ratchet and Clank 2 also started to emphasise weapon combinations. Some of the new guns act on their own rather than getting the player to hit a target directly. The mini-turret glove lays down automated blasters, and the Symphonioids fly around Ratchet and Clank, targeting any foes in range. For some of the tougher encounters, you can deploy a combination of the shield barrier, Symphonioids, and mini-turrets before whipping out the regular weapons, like the mini-rocket tube, for maximum damage output. My personal favourite is the Plasma Coil, which fires an electrical projectile over long distances. When upgraded to the Plasma Storm, it shoots an energized orb that fries every enemy in its path. The power weapons also expand with not just one, but 2 screen nukes. For a whopping 2.5 million bolts, you can purchase the Zodiac. Very low ammo count, but the resulting flash disintegrates everything in sight. The Zodiac may be more expensive, but it pales in comparison to the RYNO 2. This version of the weapon is still my favourite, a rapid-fire chain gun that hits hard and sounds awesome. You certainly won't be able to afford these your first time through, so the replay value is maintained. Hoverbike races enter the picture early on, and they make for a blazing alternative to the first game's hoverboarding. For starters, the bikes are much faster, and you'll need to pay close attention to both obstacles and power-ups as you race. It's all about keeping enough turbo boosts in the tank to stay ahead of the other competitors. Further races open up shortcuts, and even allow the enemies to target Ratchet with weapons, making them pretty merciless when it comes to difficulty. I could never beat the challenges where the racers are strapped with missile launchers. On the other side, there's arena combat, a great way to build experience points and bolt payouts. From boss battles with Chainblade at the Macta Resort to cage matches in the Megacorp games, the range of battles is far-reaching, though first you'll have to fight and platform your way to the arena itself. Planet Joba is especially tricky, with the enemy wielding laser pistols, mounted beasts, and turrets on the way through. Crystal hunting is one of the more lucrative ways of earning bolts, and across 2 planets you'll sell desert crystals and later moonstones to a mystical hermit. I must have been very impatient all those years ago, as I was able to quickly collect every desert crystal in less than an hour thanks to the newly added charge boots and the nearby Raritanium mining vehicle. Having tools that speed up the process offers additional encouragement for backtracking, especially if you're working towards a major purchase. Going back with upgraded weapons also helps you deal with the enemies. Large mini-boss creatures can take a lot of punishment, and you'll need a more powerful inventory to defend yourself. Last but certainly not least, we have the space battles, which did set a high standard at the time. Nowadays, developers almost seem reluctant to make space battles in full 3D, with unrestricted movements. Future Ratchet and Clank games would limit the player to either an on-rails section or 2D plane, and what's here in Going Commando feels deeper and more engaging. The early battles can be tough, as you're waiting to upgrade the weapon and shield systems, but further down the road, Slim Cognito's Ship Shack offers a range of improvements. Stronger blaster cannons, a higher capacity jet boost, sturdier shielding, and even a nuclear detonation device. This gives you an incentive to complete the space challenges while collecting Raritanium in the process. Shooting down tougher enemy ships and racing an opponent through rings rounds off this gameplay feature. Tying all of these components together are the platforming segments. Ratchet and Clank start the game with the O2 mask, heli, thruster and hydro packs already installed, but they continue to acquire new items. The first of these is the Furminator, which can both freeze and thaw bodies of water. This device has its best use at a Megacorp facility, where you make your way through multiple pools. On the other hand, the Tractor Beam involves the simple moving of platforms and inspector bots to break into the next area. Then we have not one, but 2 hacking minigames. The electrolyzer is a simple game of focus, while the infiltrator tests your memory to find the correct path. These mini-games are over in mere seconds, meaning they rarely outstay their welcome. All of these items succeed at breaking up the pace, though in terms of platforming, the greatest test will sometimes be the nanotech canisters. Strewn around the levels in hard-to-reach places, these also increase your health by 1 unit. This one on Planet Dobbo was always the toughest one to reach, though playing today I was able to maneuver the glider at just the right angle to snag it, something I never managed years earlier. All the new activities contribute to the game's expanded economy. You'll be spending far more bolts than you did in the first game, with even the early weapons costing at least 25,000 or more. To assist in your growing wealth, you can return to multiple planets and tackle the aforementioned challenges. But if you have the skill, you can skip over an armor purchase and keep saving for that next big armament. In my playthrough, I had most of the weapons on hand by the end of the game, while only buying a single suit of armor, which reduced damage by 15%. Just like the first game, every weapon carries over into New Game Plus, and thanks to the new Bolt Multiplier feature, you won't have to grind as long to acquire everything else. Insomniac even included a special feature for returning players. Early in the game on Planet Barlow, you'll come across a Gadgetron help matron who can provide you with the Bomb Glove, Decoy Glove, Tesla Claw, and other weapons free of charge if you already purchased them in the last game. It's a very rare component that few developers would take the time to include. Another item that never made a reappearance was the Monsterpedia, a nifty guide to all the enemies you face in each level. With all these improvements and additions, Ratchet and Clank 2 is a great title, but it doesn't quite reach the level of masterpiece. Admittedly, the story here is weaker than the first game. We've already seen Ratchet and Clank connect, so there isn't much room for character growth. The plot involves our heroes getting bamboozled by a megacorporation, something that already happened in the first game with Captain Quark, then working to uncover the truth. The opening act involves hunting down the thief and recovering the protopet. Upon doing so, Fizzwidget tosses the duo aside on planet Tabora and effectively disappears for most of the game. As it turns out, your supposed foe is another Lombax named Angela, who was working against Megacorp's corruption all along, though her species was later retconned in A Crack in Time. Angela is a likeable side character, though her appearances are fairly infrequent, making her less impactful. Some planets are much shorter and more linear than the previous game as well, which limits the scope of the shooting and platforming. Siberius is the most glaring example. To confront the thief, you make your way through a very standard collection of enemies, then hop onto a convoy of monster trucks, which takes less than 10 minutes. When you compare that with the original game, which had a larger number of pathways across most planets, this does feel like a bit of a step backwards. Be that as it may, the environments are still imaginative and detailed. They often feel more populated with a greater number of ships and even a few ambient events like robots going on a tour of the Megacorp testing facility. On planet Bolden, Ratchet and Clank fight their way to Mr. Fizzwidget, going up against the Thugs for Less elite, only to find themselves lured into a trap. This transfer back to Oranos, now converted to a prison environment, kicked off an odd trend for the series. We rarely see Ratchet and Clank get captured or knocked out. Instead, the game either fades to black or cuts to the next scene, despite them having a full arsenal of weapons. It's a strange quirk that always stuck out to me as the franchise went on. The return trip swaps back and forth between the two characters as they break out of captivity. All the way through, the music opts for a techno-sci-fi approach with a hint of militarism, though Insomniac also composed specific themes for each of the game's activities. Each track succeeds at conveying the feel of its world. The overall challenge really starts to ramp up as you enter the latter half. Planet Snivlac is another spike in difficulty, with Thugs for Less troops armed to the teeth in defense of their home base. Having confronted him 2 times already, their leader saves his toughest weapon for last. This boss is disliked by many fans, and it's not hard to see why. The fight does drag a bit, with your base weapons doing minimal damage and constantly hopping in and out of turrets to slowly wear down the giant's health. Having to target flying bombs while trying to hit the mech can get tiresome after a while. Taking down the Thugs for Less leader and rescuing Angela marks the end of Act 2 and the unleashing of the protopets on the unsuspecting masses. The small blue critters are easy to kill, but they mass multiply very quickly, meaning you'll have to take down each pod as fast as possible before they spawn more. Other foes like these exterminator bots can even attack after you blow their torsos off, forcing you to remain vigilant. Breaking into Megacorp headquarters on planet Yedil is the final scenario, and it's perhaps the most difficult final level in the series. Today I can breeze through it easily, but years ago I died many times to the robot troopers and hover tanks. It's more of a gauntlet than a culmination, with a lower use of gadgetry to make your way to the centre. Captain Quark shows up right at the end to take us to the final boss, popping out of his Fizz Widget suit and bumbling his way into creating a super protopet. This climax makes sense, as the villain has used the CEO's credentials to turn Megacorp against Ratchet, Clank and Angela. Despite only being on screen for a few minutes, Quark is still an entertaining bad guy, and the fight against the experiment is a fitting end. The way it uses the ammo crates against you and spawning a pod of mini protopets makes the fight a challenge. Eventually, the beast is subdued and the Bogon Galaxy is saved, with Quark receiving a particularly nasty punishment. At this point, we all knew a third Ratchet and Clank was on the way. It had become the flagship series for Insomniac, and they weren't about to let the duo rest. Within another year, the next entry would arrive in the defined November release slot. Ratchet and Clank had quickly become PlayStation's premier platforming franchise, pulling ahead of fellow contemporaries. Naughty Dog's Jak and Daxter also concluded its trilogy in 2004, while Sly Cooper from Sucker Punch Productions kept humming along with the second and third entries. Initially, the same schoolmates who introduced me to the series also showed off the third release round his house. Our excitement was palpable as the opening titles popped up. When I got a PlayStation 2 for my 11th birthday, Ratchet & Clank 3, known as Up Your Arsenal in the US, was bundled with the console, and I jumped straight in. It would become my favourite of the original trilogy, and definitely carries the most nostalgia. I would often invite friends over and set up 4-player deathmatches in the game's multiplayer mode. We had a ton of fun, whether it was Morpho Rays only on Aquato Sewers, or vehicle mayhem on the Bakeshi Isles. For this video, however, I'll be removing those goggles and examining the title more objectively. Ratchet & Clank 3 received high acclaim in 2004, but some fans now view the game as a bit of a letdown, one that shifted the focus too far away from platforming. The story kicks off with Ratchet & Clank chilling out in their Metropolis apartments. Angela Cross has vanished from the scene, and Clank has become the star of a 007-style spy series bearing his namesake. Quickly changing the channel, the two find out that Ratchet's former homeworld is once again under attack, this time by the Tyrannoids at the behest of Dr. Nefarious. Returning to the Solana Galaxy, our heroes charge into battle alongside the cowardly Galactic Rangers. Veldin is saved relatively easily, but the war has just begun. It quickly becomes apparent that most aren't taking the threat seriously, even the Galactic President, who calls out Clank for his showbiz rather than the situation at hand. Much like Ratchet and Clank 2, we waste no time getting to work. It's straight off to planet Florana to track down a former hero who may be key to stopping Nefarious. We all know who it is. It's Captain Quark, who has clearly gone mad from his 2-time humiliation and 4 from fame. Fighting him directly as the first boss fight is a solid continuation from previous games, packing in both humour and the satisfaction of knocking some sense into him after 2 games of villainy. One of the key changes you notice in the early going is the lock strafe control scheme. Turn this on and you no longer need to hold down the shoulder buttons, as Ratchet and Clank are always pointing straight with a defined target reticule and faster turning speed to boot. This control method makes it easier to shoot enemies while emphasising the focus on combat, though this does come at a cost, which we'll get to later. The extraction of Captain Quark transitions to the Starship Phoenix, the first hub zone in the series, with plenty of integrated amenities. Weapon and armour vendors, a VR training simulator, trophy room, ship customization, and Ratchet's personal quarters. This area is a worthwhile addition, though there are some sections like this one on the main deck that sit empty. The starship is led by Sasha, who forms a throwaway romance subplot as the game goes on. Eventually, we see the return of many characters from the first game, including Big Al, Helga, and Skid McMarks, who were each chosen for the mission more for their star power rather than actual competence. Each of them will occasionally chime in on both help desk messages and cutscenes, often commenting on various events or item acquisitions. On the opposing side, we have Dr. Nefarious, who is a total nutcase.
You can look forward to being disintegrated! That's all for now.
The fan base tends to be divided on him as a villain. Some appreciate his angry outbursts that trigger clips from a galactic soap opera, but others say he's far too over the top and silly. He's contrasted by his sarcastic butler Lawrence, who injects a bit of dry wit into the proceedings. The story here isn't very deep, but it makes up for this with wacky humour. This is by far the funniest game in the series, with tons of well-written jokes, the most blatant innuendos, and plenty of satire. Celebrity worship is one of the biggest topics here, with Secret Agent Clank taken way too seriously by the Solana Galaxy, and Ratchet being written off as his grovelling sidekick. The Lombax does most of the heavy lifting when it comes to stopping Dr. Nefarious, but others end up taking the credit. After his mental recovery, Captain Quark takes centre stage for the third title, and his bumbling numbskullery is on full display, including the 2D vid comics, which both reveal and exaggerate the superhero's achievements. Giving Quark a dark, rotten history with Dr. Nefarious, who was once an organic lifeform himself, adds a bit of depth to their scenes, but it still keeps to a similar formula from previous releases. Lines that went over my head as a kid land differently today, and the cutscenes do a great job at laying the laughs on thick. Shooting is your top priority in the third Ratchet and Clank, and the upgrade system has been expanded to 5 ranks with a further 3 when you buy the returning mega weapons in challenge mode. This is a bit of a double-edged sword for me. On the one hand, it allows weapons to be upgraded beyond basic damage stats, like a boost in ammo count and explosion radius, but on the other, you have to wait longer for the hidden special ability to unlock. This means more grinding and killing regular enemies to reach the higher weapon ranks. Some of these are well worth pursuing, with some guns receiving major improvements. The liquid nitrogen gun is far superior to the meteor gun, freezing enemies on contact. The suck cannon can now use bolt crates as ammunition, and the Agents of Doom can fly, shoot, and eventually explode in an eye-popping blast when fully upgraded. The Rift Inducer or Rift Ripper was always the best for me, a powerful black hole launcher that sucks in even the strongest enemies when fully upgraded. The RYNO 3, which unlocks after beating the game once, can be purchased for 3 million bolts, and seems to blend the Zodiac into its functionality. When fully upgraded to the Rhinocerator, a bright glow lights up the screen, turning all enemies into ash. This version of the weapon is neither the best nor the worst. It's a powerful tool, but it isn't as satisfying to shoot. When it comes to the economy and saving for weapons, these special green boxes can double your bolt and experience gain for a short time, and you no longer have to bribe specific characters to reach the next story segment. For the wider design templates, Up Your Arsenal has been heavily streamlined. Clank sections are more infrequent, replacing the bridge and hammer bots with Quark's pet monkey Scrunch, while racing and space combat have both been removed, which did baffle me at the time. Annihilation Nation, the only venue to offer arena combat, has reduced the platforming to basic obstacle courses that repeat with different layouts and enemy placement. Sewer crystals for the plumber heavily narrow down the setting to a collection of pipes, and the lone hacking minigame is more slow-paced than previous efforts. It's simple enough, shoot the red chips and collect the green ones, but the sluggish movement means you'll be pausing the action more frequently, especially with up to 4 rounds of locks to clear. Other gameplay facets include skydiving into the action while dodging missiles and the Tira guys, a simple mini-game where you persuade the enemy to let you pass. It's pretty humorous when you insult the fleshy aliens by mistake, but these sections are weaker than the holodisc guys in the original game. They lack both challenge and flexibility, as any attempt to switch off the gadgets will result in instant death on planet Aquatos. The Quark vid comics are the final piece of the package, and they also mark the developer's first foray into 2D gameplay. All 5 are very well done for what they are, simple side-scrolling courses that take you through the captain's escapades and unlock story missions. The assault scenarios are the biggest addition to RNC3, falling in line with the robotic doctor's war on the galaxy. You'll team up with the Galactic Rangers on several operations, which pop up either as part of the story, such as the arenas on Marcadia and Blackwater City, or as a side objective when you've completed the main task. The Rangers are mostly there to convey the sense of total war, their blasters barely grazing the enemy. It's all about on-foot and vehicular carnage here, with the turbo slider and hover ship making their debuts. Both control incredibly well and deliver a damaging barrage to the Tyrannoid menace. Across a set of 4 to 5 missions with high bolt payouts, you'll fight from one side of the map to the other, eventually taking out 2 Gatling guns to capture the enemy base. Anyone paying attention to the game's main menu noticed this was very similar to the Siege mode in Ratchet and Clank 3's multiplayer component. Many a fan argues that this feature took away from the main campaign, most notably with the reusing of maps between the 2 modes. In some ways this is true, and shows most clearly with the level design, as opposed to the wider planets of previous titles. The biggest weakness of Ratchet and Clank 3 is the platforming, or often the lack thereof. The balance is tilted heavily to one side with around 70% shooting and 30% platforming. Most of the traditional levels have been condensed to straightforward gauntlets with the occasional hypershot target, zipline and gravity ramp along the way. The glider and grind rails have also been removed. For a vast majority of game time, you're pushing forward, which limits the scope and scale of the planets. Take the return of Metropolis Kerwin, which shifts from the city centre to a residential district. You make your way through one straight route of samey looking towers with a couple of light detours for titanium bolts and a minuscule refractor section thrown in for good measure. When compared to the first game, which had 2 defined routes and several nooks and crannies along the way, this is ultimately a regression. Sure, the Biobliterator upgrades the Tyrannoids into robot versions, but it doesn't change much outside of the overall difficulty. The weakest example of this is the warp pad, which seems pretty cool when you try it out. After setting a destination, Ratchet & Clank will teleport a short distance. The problem is how it is only used for a single planet on a brief section in the most linear manner possible, bypassing both a lift and force field to push through to the next firefight. How you react to this change depends on personal preference. Do you prefer platforming, shooting, or a combination of the two? This shift wouldn't please everyone, though at 11 years old I didn't mind in the slightest. Most planets have put aside the multi-route structure, with the only real exceptions being Planet Dax and Hollow-Star Studios. The former sees a split in objectives with a heavily guarded terminal in the main building and a boss fight against an enemy gunship out on the islands. There's also a quick side detour to pick up the charge boots on the left. Hollow-Star Studios features 3 separate scenarios, the first being the filming of a Secret Agent Clank episode, which culminates in a single giant Clank sequence. The following Ratchet section marks a major difficulty spike as these hulking green Tyrannoids enter the picture. Escaping the ambush is a tough challenge, and once you make it back to the ship, completing other objectives leads to the first big twist. Corny Gears, who is clearly in league with Dr. Nefarious and a rip-off of the real-life Britney Spears, kidnaps Skid and reveals Nefarious's grand scheme, using the Biobliterator to transform all organic life into robots. The ensuing boss fight with Miss Gears bathes in celebrity excess, a loud pop song blaring in the background and backing dancers coming at you with their spinning kicks. This is then followed up by a begrudging partnership with Captain Quark. At the Zeldrin starport, the trio sneak onto Dr. Nefarious's ship, only to find it was a trap. Much like the Blarg station, Ratchet & Clank must escape the vessel before time runs out. Quark stays behind to look for something important and is presumed to be dead. A majority of these levels unfold with a single main path to follow. So overall, a more straightforward release, but that's not to say the game is lacking when it comes to completion and replayability. Far from it, as Ratchet & Clank 3 features unlockable skins, the returning skill points, and the trophy room aboard the Starship Phoenix. This is your main measuring tool for collectibles, with some trophies unlocked for reaching various milestones and others found within the game world. While playing, I quickly noticed a locked door and figured this would open on grabbing every trophy. Shortly after the game came out, some friends at school told me about the Insomniac Museum. At first I didn't believe them, but when I found a seemingly broken teleporter on Metropolis and set my PS2 clock to 3 AM, I stumbled across one of the best bonus features in gaming history. Insomniac Games has always been a passionate company, and that was put on full display with their special developer level. Here you can tackle some tough hacking challenges, test out some unused or cancelled gameplay features, and get some insights into the development process. While not the first time the museum appeared in the series, I wish more creators would include things like this and go beyond the base release. It seemed to go out of style on the 7th generation of consoles. Also impressive are the bonuses for returning players. Those with a Ratchet and Clank 1 save file get a 10% Gadgetron discount on all weapons, while Ratchet and Clank 2 players can get some free guns from Slimcognito, including, yes please, the plasma coil. While many of the planets are lesser versions of their predecessors, the title maintains the colourful approach to worlds. The Urbani moons are a major highlight as they bring back the spherical structure for some enjoyable traversal. The music is a blend of old and new motifs, mirroring the return to the Solana galaxy. The main themes for Blackwater City and Metropolis Kerwin are easily recognisable, but Ratchet & Clank 3 takes a step towards more pounding action pieces. The initial assault on the Tyrannoid homeworld has one of the best tracks, pulling you straight into the combat upon landing. The final act of the game begins after investigating the Leviathan crash site. Quark managed to escape in a pod and has no interest in returning to the Phoenix. Eventually, the elusive fifth vid comic, this time narrated by Slimcognito, reveals the truth. The slippery bastard has fled to a secret hideout on the Fran asteroid belt. After a challenging battle through waves of Quark robots, the trio finally meet face to face with some stern words. Quark plans to cower in his luxury tower while the rest of the galaxy goes to hell, but Ratchet and Clank challenge him in their own ways. As one of the few dedicated character moments throughout the game, this scene always stood out to me, the point where Quark finally thinks about redeeming himself at the trilogy's end. The attack on the Starship Phoenix I always found incredibly difficult despite its short length. Most of the enemies are both fast and lethal. Muscle your way to the bridge and you'll find the Q-Force safe and sound. I always thought this was a bit of a cop-out, to see the cast hiding under the pilot's seat completely unharmed. Nefarious injuring or capturing them would have raised the stakes for the climax. Planet Kronos is another one-man gauntlet with a ton of projectiles flying at you, culminating in Clank destroying the Bio-Obliterator. You can either gun down every enemy or race through to the control room, dodging every step of the way. This isn't quite the end, as the narrative suddenly whips out a second Bio-Obliterator model on planet Milos. Fighting your way to the death device, which immediately takes off when you get there, leads to Dr. Nefarious as the first of two final bosses. The final battle itself may look like a hefty spectacle, but the Bio-Obliterator's mechanized form is nowhere near as difficult as the enemies leading up to it. You simply fly around the missiles in the hovership while holding down the trigger. Quark's grand reappearance is rendered moot by his ship cruising around the boss rather than lending his own firepower. Nefarious and Lawrence teleport out at the last possible moments, stranding themselves on an asteroid for the next 5 years. Meanwhile, the Q-Force celebrates their victory with a showing of the latest Secret Agent Clank episode. Whether Ratchet finally received recognition for his efforts is up for debate, but it's a suitable close to the story. Most reviewers at the time had a blast with Ratchet and Clank 3, and while it has its faults, the third entry is far from a major disappointment. The next title would strike out in a different direction. With 3 stellar games under their belt, where would the dynamic duo go next? The answer came in 2005's Ratchet Gladiator, or Deadlocked in North America. I had already played through the trilogy several times at that point, so anything remotely connected to the franchise was right up my street, as I looked for details in magazines before buying the game straight away. I didn't care that Clank was dropped from both the title and core gameplay, I just wanted more from the series, and Gladiator delivered just that, albeit in an altered form. Jak and Daxter had already gone down a darker path with Jak X, so Insomniac thought they would do the same. Opting for a less jump, more shoot approach, the fourth release puts Ratchet in a high-tech combat suit and dumps him into an underground combat sport, very much in the vein of 1987's The Running Man. The scale may be smaller and the gameplay simplified, but the fourth release boasts several claims to fame. It remains the only mainline entry to offer both squad-based and cooperative gameplay. In terms of tone and atmosphere, it's also the only release to experiment with a moodier approach. Sometime after Ratchet and Clank 3, Ratchet, Clank and Big Al have taken charge on board the Starship Phoenix, The craft is abruptly invaded by agents of Gleeman Vox, master of the Shadow Sector and owner of the illegal combat show Dread Zone. Having saved the galaxy 3 times over, Ratchet and Clank are prime real estate for the media mogul and his vast empire. A deadlock collar is strapped around the marsupial's neck, and we start the game in a very different setting, a training course. Clank has been relegated to a back seat, offering guidance and information over the comlink. In his place, at least in single-player mode, are 2 combat bots. Merc, the tough one, and Green, the nervous one, are at your disposal via the D-pad. They'll hover around the environment, attacking enemies automatically, and following your commands to turn bolt cranks or hack glowing orbs. They don't steal too many kills from the player, instead keeping the onslaught from becoming too overwhelming. With the exception of missed grind rails and accidental recall orders, the bots are very responsive to your commands, and never get caught up on the scenery. As for how the game plays, Ratchet Gladiator is still the biggest departure in that field. At times it can feel like a more direct version of bullet hell. You're constantly on the move, swapping through weapons and jumping at just the right moment to avoid incoming projectiles. Some are relatively straightforward like the regular robot troopers, but other obstacles like these laser turrets can catch you unaware. Dropships or simple drop pods are often delivering your foes to the battlefield. The range of enemies on display is good, though due to the more singular gameplay facets, you'll have had your fill of axe-wielding giants and flying buzzards before the end. Each planet is presented as a new episode of the game show, with simple camera angles flying across the map, letting you know which direction to take. As you fight your way up the Dread Zone rankings, a relatively small number of objectives will persist. Bolt cranks, destroying targets, or simply fighting your way to a vehicle section. Each mission concludes when you reach the end of the obstacle course or take on a boss. That brings us to the Exterminators, Shellshock, Reactor, the Eviscerator, and their leader Ace Hardlight. All 4 villains take pleasure in killing heroes on Dread Zone, and they represent the most fast-paced battles in the campaign. Some have brief story segments, like a brief reappearance by Courtney Gears in Reactor's backstory, but they don't mean much to the bigger picture. I always found the Eviscerator the most challenging fight due to his rapid acrobatics and fast-moving attacks. Ace Hardlight reaches a bit closer story-wise when he shoots Al, zaps Ratchet via his deadlock collar, and has a brief heart-to-heart before he dies, warning our hero not to turn out the way he did. Corruption is one underlying theme in Ratchet Gladiator, something the other games haven't really touched on since. Of course, to fight your way to the top, you'll need firearms. 10 weapons may seem low, but Ratchet Gladiator uses this approach to make the action flow more quickly. You can cycle through every gun with a push of R2, and use the swing shot by jumping towards a target and holding down the fire button. You'll rarely have to slow down the action to equip a weapon or gadget from the pause menu, and the endless blasting never stops, only pausing for a brief moment when you're turning a bolt crank, swinging across gaps, or using the charge boots to blaze across the landscape. Each of the guns you use are fairly standard, focusing less on wacky functions and more on direct damage. The dual Raptors are rapid-fire machine guns, the Magma Cannon a crowd-controlling shotgun, the B6 Obliterator a chunky grenade launcher, the Arbiter a high-damage rocket launcher, and the Fusion Rifle a long-range sniper. More exotic armaments like the Hunter Mine Launcher and Scorpion Flail offer more indirect ways of inflicting damage, while the weapon combos are given greater emphasis. You can use the Hollow Shield Launcher to form a protective fence around Ratchet, mine the exterior to deal with any incoming foes, and finally add mini-turrets to form a near-impenetrable defensive posture. This is especially useful if you're low on health. The ultimate weapon this time is not the RYNO, but the Harbinger. For 2 million bolts, you can launch a devastating missile barrage that destroys everything in front of you, another effective screen nuke. The carnage gets so intense, and sometimes it can impact the frame rates when multiple explosions are going off. On top of that, Gladiator also introduces the first customizable elements to the arsenal through Omega and Alpha mods. The former includes acid, shock, napalm, and some more unorthodox abilities like morphing, brainwashing, or sticking the enemy with a time bomb. Some Omega mods are clearly best used on specific weapons, like the grenade launcher leaving napalm on the ground, but being able to mix and match these is a good step forward. Sometime later, this idea would expand with the Constructor weapons on the PS3. Alpha mods are more iterative, improving weapon fire rates, ammo counts, and blast radius among other attributes. When you start challenge mode, alpha mods can be purchased at a high price for further experimentation. If you want dual raptors with rapid fire, you can do that, but you may sacrifice ammo count in the process. Outside of this, the automatic weapon upgrades return with 10 ranks and the occasional wrench and combat bot upgrades. Going into a second playthrough, your weapons can reach level 99, the highest in the series. As for further unlockables, we have the Dread Zone trading cards, which unlock in the containment suites for completing feats like beating the game on the highest difficulty or earning all the skill points. Where Ratchet Gladiator really advances is with the vehicles, not just 2, but 4 of them. The hoverbike makes a combat-oriented return with fluid control and rapid-fire guns, the Puma boasts both a mounted cannon and regular guns, the hovership has both a regular blaster and missile system, and the powerful Landstalker smashes its way across the battlefield with reckless abandon. Some level challenges put you in full control, while others see you on a fixed track for target shooting. The former is definitely the preferred option, as you have free reign around the larger maps. Every assault transport feels great to control, and if the enemy becomes too great, you can simply return to a vehicle pad for instant repairs. Sometimes enemies will use Landstalkers as well, and they can quickly make mincemeat of Ratchet if you don't make use of the combat bot's EMP function. The fourth release in the series is shorter and more compact, but outside of the more unique challenges, the core design can wear thin over time. To increase your point score and unlock new planets, the Dread challenges extend the game's runtime a little bit. Racing through checkpoints is standard fare, but the best objectives involve a mix of shooting and rail grinding. Climbing the Tower of Power and the Corkscrew in the Battle Dome are 2 highlights because they're able to mix things up with some platform hopping. Still, around 80 to 85% of gameplay is spent shooting both on foot and in vehicles, with less to break up the pace. I did enjoy it immensely at the time, but Gladiator couldn't quite match the original trilogy for overall fun factor. That isn't the only issue I have with the game today. I've mentioned before that going darker and angrier works well for some franchises and less so for others. Ratchet Gladiator falls somewhere in the middle here. With the duo's characteristics established over 3 games, the narrative's attempts at edginess can be a bit forced at times. When Ratchet says these guys obviously don't know who they're messing with, it feels a bit out of place considering the persona James Arnold Taylor has created in prior games. The Dread Zone announcers also grow repetitive. Dallas and One Eater are your typical self-obsessed sensationalist hosts who constantly insult and belittle Ratchet as a wanton criminal. Their news show, Pox News, seemingly a parody of the infamous Fox News in the US, has its ups and downs. In cutscenes between levels, the banter between them can be amusing, but during the action the same voice lines are cycled through multiple times.
What I want to know is how Ratchet uses the bathroom in that suit.
Oh, come on! Will somebody just kill this little runt already?
Run, Ratchet, run!
It doesn't reach an obnoxious level, but the repeating quips can grate your ears as the game goes on. What also re-emerges are the subtle jabs at capitalism and profiteering. The lead antagonist, Gleeman Vox, personifies this more than any other character. He's a corporate businessman, endlessly pursuing maximum sales and merchandising out of his gladiators and the blood sport they partake in. Endless commercialism is his main forte, and the most infamous moment comes when he tries one last time to sell his useless stock of Ace Hardlight action figures mere hours after the man himself fell in combat. Ratchet doesn't play into his scheme, rejecting Vox's offer of wealth and riches in exchange for brutal violence. In keeping with the more ruthless side of the contest, every element of Ratchet Gladiator feels more rugged and unforgiving. Much of the colour is drained from the environments, leaving the enemies and architecture to convey their identity. Seraphos is a murky swamp, and Planet Stygia is nothing but bridges suspended at a high altitude. Planet Torval is one of the moodier locations seen in the franchise, a grotty, run-down wasteland you can't wait to escape from. The game makes no apologies for its style and tone. Shooting your way through the Shadow Sector is a grittier, more intense affair, and the soundtrack, with its heavier use of grungy rock guitars, will make you remember that. With the Dread Zone ranking system regularly accessible, you know exactly how things will play out. After taking out all 4 exterminators, Ratchet heads for the Ghost Station, aka the Gauntlet of Doom. Aside from the aesthetic change on the enemies, I didn't really see any increase in challenge, making its build-up rather weak. Following that, our protagonist infiltrates the Battle Dome interior to sabotage Dread Zone and free the trapped heroes. It's a final sprint against the clock to destroy the systems powering the containment suite and defeating Vox in the final boss fight. This second climax is a lot better. The timer is very generous no matter which difficulty you're on, the music is kick-ass, and the fight with Vox is a fitting encounter, as he launches many varied attacks from his high-powered mech suit. Take him down and our heroes finally escape the Battle Dome, rescuing legions of fans and their imprisoned compatriots in the process. Ratchet Gladiator marks the end of the PlayStation 2 era. While the series had 2 handheld efforts, Size Matters and Secret Agent Clank from High Impact Games, the standard def generation had effectively ended. The next PlayStation was on the horizon, and a new, more personal journey for the duo would soon begin. The Ratchet and Clank quadrilogy would keep me satisfied for the next couple of years, as Insomniac took a short break from the series, crafting Resistance Fall of Man to launch the PlayStation 3 in 2006. I've already covered this FPS franchise in another retrospective which you can find on my channel. While playing Resistance, I waited with great anticipation for my favourite series to return. When the announcement trailer finally arrived in early 2007, I went bonkers. It was a dream come true. The futuristic platformer was continuing on new hardware and with a substantial leap forward in technical presentation to boot. In the lead up to release, I was constantly scouring the web for new updates and information. Of course, I bought the game day one and loved every second of it, though I was 12 years old at the time, and some 15 years later my opinions have shifted. Tools of Destruction certainly isn't the best game in the series or its genre, but it's still an enjoyable time from start to finish. The story picks up after the 2 PSP adventures, but you don't need to have played previous releases to get into this new tale. This is very much a new start for the duo as they embark on the next quest. Things start off simple. Ratchet and Clank are passing the time on Metropolis Kerwin by engineering and flying a rocket sled, which doesn't go too well, leading us straight into an attack from some heavily armed robotic commandos. So the game begins and, well, just look at it. The first game in the future trilogy looks absolutely fantastic. Many reviewers at the time compared Tools of Destruction to a Pixar movie, and it still resembles one to this day. The backdrop of a deadly space armada wrecking the city is an excellent showcase for the new console hardware, with the destruction of walkways and entire buildings as you make your way through. Character models and facial expressions are now much more detailed, with distinctive features and endlessly vibrant colours. Everywhere you look, it's a feast for the eyes. This same dynamic detail also applies to the enemies, the first of which being the Drophids. Strapped inside their combat suits, every time you take one of them out, the small fish creatures shatter out of their helmets and sit harmlessly on the ground. It's little touches like these that set the game apart from the PS2 originals. We're also reacquainted with multiple gameplay scenarios, shooting, grind rails, launch pads, and skydiving to name a few. Tools of Destruction bears the closest resemblance to Ratchet and Clank 3, with some added bells and whistles. The developer ambition shows most clearly with the technical details, rather than altering the core formula. Pushing gaming animation to a new benchmark is easily their finest achievement. Making their way to the Planetary Defense Center to rescue Captain Quark, then grinding along the rails to escape, the game's story begins in earnest as we're introduced to Emperor Tachyon, last of the Kragmites and a massive loudmouth.
Emperor Percival Tachyon, Crown Prince of the Kragmites, conqueror of space and time, and, pending the obliteration of a few insubordinate species, ruler of the universe.
He's hell-bent on destroying Ratchet, the last Lombax in the universe, for reasons we'll soon learn over the course of the story. The duo managed to hijack Tachyon's lead ship a little too easily and crash land in the Polaris galaxy. The second main story thread is also established as Clank has a cryptic dream. Mysterious entities known as the Zoni guide him to the Hall of Knowledge on planet Kortog, immediately generating some intrigue and informing the player of where this new adventure will go. After 4 mainline games, Insomniac had never delved into the duo's backstory before. No longer would they be simple fish-out-of-water everyman characters who take on greater odds. Instead, they would be rebranded as the Chosen Ones, unaware of their destinies. In the future saga, Ratchet's race is a group of benevolent galactic protectors, while Clank is the only robot of his kind, bound for greater things. This trope has been seen countless times in stories through the decades, and the choice to move in that direction has been heavily criticised by the fanbase. It set Ratchet and Clank on a course to be lumped in with countless animated tales aimed at children, reducing their relatable side in the process. Back in 2007, I was fully invested in the story, but years later I can see where the fans are coming from. Early on, we reached Planet Fastoon, once the former homeworld of the Lombaxes, now in ruins. The scavenger hunt to fix a downed ship establishes Ratchet's search for answers, while informing the player that the PS3 games will strike out in a different narrative direction. This isn't always for the best. Tools of Destruction may take place in another new galaxy, but it feels smaller and less imaginative. Rather than coming across a set of quirky characters, we have a smaller collection who are often represented by this unnamed smuggler who relies heavily on the basic space cowboy archetype. He pops up every so often both now and in future releases, and each time his character never changes. He's there to occasionally transport our leads from one location to another and serve as a vendor for the returning crystal hunting challenges. When you compare the smuggler to previous characters with all their wacky characteristics, he isn't all that memorable and barely registers when it comes to comedy. Another weak element is the introduction of robot space pirates, personified by Captain Slag and Rusty Pete. The game's visuals and audio elements do a great job of presenting their mannerisms, but in terms of writing they come off as very uninspired. The same also goes for the continued radio transmissions from Tachyon's forces. A Jothic commander will frequently comment on the in-game action, and you can see the franchise slowly inching towards the line of characters not shutting up during gameplay. The blend between platforming and shooting has taken a step back towards the centre, with around 65% platforming and 35% shooting. When Ratchet is on foot, the gameplay is both familiar and easily accessible, with a couple of level deviations, such as Emperor Tachyon's Trail of Turning Terror, being used to obtain special items. Tools of Destruction is at its best when the straightforward levels include a variety of encounters. Take the pirate outpost on the Creeley Comet. To reach the Iris supercomputer, you'll fight your way through a band of enemies, reach the top of a pirate vessel, grind your way over a gap, shimmy around a corner, and take on a more challenging and heavily guarded camp, culminating with a mini-boss in a tight area right before the objective. This setup mixes things up more effectively than Ratchet and Clank 3's interpretation of Planet Kerwin, but not every level makes use of this formula. On top of the weaker cast of characters, some design regressions have migrated into the PS3 debut as well, especially when it comes to linearity. Ryken 5 is one of the weaker planets, as the path you take is completely straight with no deviation. You skydive in with 2 AI buddies, fight your way through 2 wide arenas to reach the spaceport, then make use of the gyro cycle for the first time to make your way to a secret Lombax laboratory away from the main refinery. The gyro cycle is used in only 3 obstacle courses, one being optional, leaving it to suffer the same fate as Ratchet and Clank 3's warp pad. Originally, it was going to use the much maligned 6-axis function, tilting the controller to turn the vehicle. Instead, this functionality was placed on other items like the Decryptor, a hacking minigame where you roll a ball around and conduct electricity, and the Geolaser, a tacked-on addition for Clank where you guide the cursor through the targets to break through to the next area. Speaking of Clank, his sections are also back, this time with the Zoni guiding him through a more simplistic set of levels. Their energy projectile attacks are automated, and the commands Clank can give have also been streamlined to moving platforms and powering up generators. If it wasn't for Clank's new levitate and time slow abilities, these levels would be no different from the PS2 versions. The gyro cycle isn't the only gameplay scenario that falls flat. From a design standpoint, this is easily the biggest drawback in Tools of Destruction. Many of the platforming elements are either too basic or hardly used. It feels like a case of quantity over quality. Swimming makes an all too brief appearance, and stealth sequences also make a return with the Hollow Pirate disguise. But this is even more basic than the Tiragais in the third R&C title. All you have to do is match the pirate dance moves with the analog stick to open locked doors. It's humorous the first few times, but quickly wears out its welcome. Space combat with the new talking ship Aphelion had a lot of potential for improvement on the 7th generation, but the free on-rail sections leave much to be desired. They all look very fancy with their flashy effects and larger pirate vessels, but being on a conveyor belt really limits the overall engagement. Other sections like the Gelinator and Robo-Wings fare a bit better, even if they are incredibly simple. Using green gel cubes to bounce your way to higher ground is a very straightforward platforming challenge, and the Robo-Wings allow for full exploration once you've completed the initial Sony ring course. The biggest highlight, and arguably the best planet in Tools of Destruction, is Sargasso, which reminds me a lot of the Sergeant Byrd sections in Spyro 3. Allowing the player to fly where they choose, taking on enemies and landing on the gigantic Troglosaurs is something no other planet in the game can match. When it comes to the arsenal, Tools of Destruction utilises a mixture of traditional guns like the rocket-firing Negotiator, lock-on Predator Launcher, and the flame-spewing Pyro Blaster, alongside the exotic functions we've come to know from the series. Some of the more handy tech includes the Nano Swarmers, mechanised bees that do massive damage to groups of enemies, the Magnet Launcher which stops enemies in place for great crowd control, and the Tornado Launcher which sucks up enemies in a satisfying display of destruction. The game takes full advantage of the PS3 hardware to add a few extra effects to the guns. The Shard Reaper leaves ice spikes sticking out of enemies, the Shock Ravager delivers bolts of electricity, and the Combustor projectiles bounce off enemies and leave flames on the ground. One of my favourites was the Alpha Disruptor, a mighty laser cannon the duo stumbles across on planet Sargasso. Charging up and releasing a devastating blast makes short work of most enemies. You'll get a healthy use of every gun at the returning arena mode. The Imperial Fight Festival takes place on planet Mirko, which you'll get to early on. Captain Quark has sold out to Tachyon, becoming the arena announcer to save his own skin. Once you fight your way to the arena, the selection of challenges is competent if a little anemic. Despite going back there twice as part of the story, you'll quickly exhaust the bulk rewards on offer, making it more of a location for grinding out experience points. On top of the regular weapons, we have the combat devices, which are both overpowered and low on supply. They include the Groovitron, Mr. Zircon, Leech Bomb, Death Springs, and the Visicopter, to name a few. Whether it's making every single enemy, including bosses and allies, dance uncontrollably, or a hovering droid that trash talks enemies while blasting everything in sight, each offers a more unconventional approach to combat. Though generally I rarely used most of these tools unless the situation demanded it. If you're having a hard time in combat, the devices can often act as win buttons, making quick work of the enemies, but they also stand on their own with no upgrades or additional abilities. The Groovitron in particular was used heavily in the game's marketing, and you can later purchase a golden version with unlimited ammo. The amount of effort it must have taken to create dance animations for every single character is impressive in itself, and there's even a skill point for triggering all of them throughout the game. Any experience points are best gathered for the standard weaponry, and this makes use of a new upgrade tree system. Plugging Raritanium into ammo count, explosion radius, area of effect, damage, and other factors will gradually fill up 4 upgrade bars, regardless of the weapon's level, which once again goes up to V5 and later VX in challenge mode. Despite these changes, some weapons do lose their usefulness later on, most notably the starting Combustor and Fusion Grenade. Even when maxed out, these weapons will do limited damage to tougher enemies and bosses. It's one case where the weapons become unbalanced over time. Of course, one weapon that doesn't become unbalanced is the RYNO 4, which has also undergone a key change. Rather than saving up a large amount of bolts, you'll now search for hollow plans throughout the environments. Take these to the smuggler and he'll put the ultimate weapon together for you. The end result is another rapid-fire chain gun, but this time the projectiles scatter in an unpredictable arc, making the weapon less satisfying to use. The game's story comes to its first turning point on reaching the Apogee space station. After collecting some more Leviathan souls for the smuggler and using the gravity boots to make your way around the exterior, a challenging and claustrophobic battle ensues. These defense turrets and hovering droids do a lot of damage, and a trio of new characters are soon introduced. Tailwind Apogee, much like Angela Cross before her, is well voiced and well animated, but she never rises beyond being a simple side character. As for Kronk and Zephyr, Their characterization all boils down to a couple of bickering old men. It's neither imaginative nor humorous, and the dialogue between them doesn't land very well. Indeed, that can be said for much of the writing in Tools of Destruction and all the games that followed. It seems the shift to colourful 3D animation also triggered a change in script priorities. The humour is less witty, the innuendos have been toned down, and any comedic threads are dropped in favour of the more personal story. The previous 4 games have jokes that still land today, but there's no doubt that the future saga shifted more towards a younger audience. It's not a deal breaker, but many long-term fans find these titles less enjoyable as a result. From here, the story shifts to tracking down clues to the Lombax species and their ultimate invention that eliminated the Kragmites in the Polaris Great War. Tachyon is the last of his kind as well, and despite not making many appearances across the story, we can still understand how his motives clash with Ratchet's. Along the way, the Sony deliver multiple visions to Clank that speak to future events, and he starts to butt heads with his long-term friend. If you've been following the duo since the PlayStation 2 days, it doesn't really make much sense for Ratchet to mistrust Clank on the Sony's existence. They've already been through thick and thin together, and should trust each other absolutely. But the game needs to have some personal conflict, so the cutscenes keep cutting to the duo gradually bickering more and more. This comes to a head at 2 points, rescuing Tywin from Zordoom prison and battling Captain Slag on his pirate fleet. Luckily, this later set of levels features several set pieces to show off a larger scale. Breaking in and breaking back out of Zordoom puts many gameplay sequences into a single gauntlet. Grind rails, decryptor puzzles, sneaking past searchlights, skydiving into the cell blocks, then shooting your way to freedom. All of it speaks to a linear level done right. The following Kirchu City section was often shown off in gameplay demonstrations, and for good reason. It's another set of combat encounters with space pirates flying in on their ships, capped off with the Kirchu Guardian. It towers above you, smashing up the grind rail as you make your way to the centre for a challenging boss fight that uses both the ceiling and the floor to mix things up. I found myself wishing that more bosses throughout the game used this kind of scenario rather than falling back on the basic shooting. As you make your way through each of these objectives, the music also follows a similar theme to the first RNC game, a mixture of tracks for each planet, individual themes for each gadget section, while also amping up the combat music. Much like the original game, Ratchet and Clank eventually put aside their disagreements, though it doesn't convey as much impact due to the bond they built in previous games. Right when they seem to have secured the Dimensionator, someone else swipes it, first Captain Slag and then Captain Quark, who unwittingly delivers the device into Tachyon's hands. It's a sinister moment as the Kragmites re-emerge from another dimension to wreak havoc on the galaxy. After a couple of brief solo segments, Ratchet and Clank resolve to take Tachyon down and reclaim the Dimensionator, but not before defeating the Kragmites attacking planet Igliak and rescuing Captain Quark yet again. This is clearly his biggest blunder yet, and his role in the story effectively ends afterwards. In some ways, the character feels like a bit of an obligation in this title, and like other characters, the humour has been dialed back a fair bit. Much like the first game, we return to Planet Fastoon for the climax. Ratchet, Tywin and the 2 droids fight their way through an onslaught of elite Drophids, backed up by enforcers and Kragmite soldiers, to reach the court of Azimuth. The sheer number of enemies can become overwhelming, but as long as you dodge the deadly projectiles from the Kragmites, you'll make it through to the finish line without many problems. Tachyon taunts Ratchet, and by extension the player, with the elusive answers we've been looking for throughout the title. He's a tricky final boss, but that mostly comes down to his inflated health bar and highly damaging attacks towards the end. The combination of a deadly laser and missile barrage always caught me off guard, as they leave very few safe locations to leap to. The game practically demands the use of the Groovitron here. If the pint-sized Emperor is stuck in a dance loop, he won't be able to use his most deadly weapons. Upon defeat, Tachyon falls into a black hole, and Ratchet and Clank use the Dimensionator to return home. The characters seem safe and sound in the Apogee station, but right at the last moment, the Zoni appear in full for the first time, picking up Clank and taking him away to an undisclosed location. The ending is an inconclusive one. Tools of Destruction committed to telling Ratchet and Clank's backstory, but it didn't deliver much of the finer details. On the negative side, very few of the game's mysteries were properly uncovered, but we also knew we were guaranteed another entry in the series. Ratchet and Clank Future Tools of Destruction was an ambitious game, but many of its accomplishments were ultimately limited to graphical presentation. Despite being an enjoyable title, the new gameplay components didn't make a massive impression. The fanbase didn't have long to wait for the next game, but rather than a full-fledged sequel, the next release would take advantage of the new digital download scene. Ratchet and Clank had never been an online-focused series. Sure, they did have multiplayer for up to 8 players at one point, but every game up to 2008 had been a disc-based release. As technology advanced and online functionality expanded, new avenues opened up on the new PlayStation Network. Some developers chose to experiment with arcade-focused releases, while others created shorter outings at a cheaper price. The next adventure, Quest for Booty, was the first time Insomniac dabbled in this field, and with most of their efforts focused on Resistance 2, the sideshow was a worthy endeavour that didn't take away from their primary project. Due to its small scale, I skipped over this middle chapter at first, catching up on the story with YouTube videos before the next major release. But when the PlayStation Network got hacked in 2011, I chose Quest for Booty as one of the free games Sony offered as a consolation. It's available as a physical copy at most second-hand stores nowadays, and was, in essence, an expansion for Tools of Destruction, cutting back on story, items, and overall length for a comfortable mini-adventure. It only takes around 3 to 4 hours to complete, and introduces a handful of items that would carry through into the next title. Picking up right where the last game left off, Ratchet and Talwyn set out in search of clues for Clank's whereabouts, which leads them to a pirate fleet on planet Murdergraw. The old pirate lord Captain Darkwater is the only lead with connections to the Zoni, and the brief prologue section is entirely linear, with the returning combustor and fusion grenade both starting off at rank 3. Anyone who played the prior release will have no trouble jumping back in, while newcomers are treated to a fairly seamless tutorial. Rusty Pete is also back, clutching his old captain's severed head and serving as narrator for the story. His backhanded schemes are certainly the most contrived part of Quest for Booty, but for now the clumsy robot stuffs the duo into a cannon and launches them to the next location. The island of Hulafar is the main setting, with a run-of-the-mill set of aliens managing the place. Climbing your way to the top of wind turbines to restore the power systems is your first objective, and the use of the gravity boots makes it an easy-going affair. You're automatically teleported back to ground level afterwards. What's interesting about QFB is how all these platforming tasks are arranged in one larger environment. There are no loading times until you transfer to a new area, which are often masked by storybook-style cutscenes. This same level structure would carry into A Crack in Time. Aside from this change, Quest for Booty is very slimlined. Outside of rare purchases from the returning smuggler, a few grind rails and the occasional catapult, this is easily the most basic entry in the mainline series. There are no golden bolts, no armor sets, no hacking minigames, limited weapon upgrades, and a massively reduced enemy pool. For most of the first act, Ratchet doesn't have any firearms at all, which sets the title apart from every other release. This structure is a good fit for a downloadable game, but it also reduces replayability. Outside of difficulty settings, this middle chapter is a one-and-done experience. As you venture deeper in, Quest for Booty reveals more inventive platforming scenarios. These darker sections are easily the best bits of the overall experience, as they make use of 2 new gameplay components, picking up creatures with the wrench, and using a kinetic tether to move platforms back and forth. To avoid deadly bats in the caves, tossing a luminous alien is your only option. Utilising the same art style, the animations remain wonderfully expressive. The way the little green blobs tremble in your grip is a great touch. This is contrasted with the imposing beasts lurking in the depths, and the green lighting that takes over the visuals when the pirate curse is unleashed. At first you'll be avoiding the larger creatures, but once Ratchet gets his guns back, you're able to take some quick revenge as you escape. Further tools include the returning Nano Swarmers and Predator Launcher, which are gradually added to the inventory. Surprising no one, Rusty Pete betrays Ratchet and uses the hidden curse to resurrect Captain Slag in Darkwater's body, setting off to do some pillaging. The ensuing island defense isn't all that special. The pirate ghosts are easily taken out with regular weapons, and the turret section doesn't deliver anything beyond what you'd expect. Simply shoot out the ship turrets and Darkwater will retreat. After rescuing the residents of Hulafar, we set off to an uncharted island that houses the Fulcrum Star. Solving a few basic puzzles involving pirate grog, shanties and symbols is a neat diversion, with the game leaning well into a swashbuckling tone. The star is finally located, but the pirates swipe it and leave Ratchet to escape another set of catacombs. One purchase of the Alpha Cannon later, we return to the pirate fleets for the final battle. Like most of the package, Captain Darkwater is pretty easy. Just dodge his sword strikes, keep the enemies in check, and he'll go down in no time. Placing the Fulcrum Star back into its pedestal, Ratchet finally tracks down his missing pal, but the exact location is shrouded in darkness, saving the full reveal for later. The Sony have placed Clank in stasis and require additional assistance to mend him. The helper in question is none other than Dr. Nefarious, who would once again take centre stage for the follow-up. The promised third chapter would arrive 1 year later, leaving Quest for Booty as a mere novelty. This one is for fans only. You can easily skip over it and head straight for the end of the future trilogy. Through most of the PlayStation 3's life cycle, Ratchet and Clank would remain a premier platforming property. Their only major competition on the console would come from Media Molecule's Little Big Planet, another series I previously discussed on this channel. A Crack in Time was the last entry I bought when it was new, effectively ending my personal investment in the series. In 2009, most of my schoolmates had moved on to adult-oriented releases, especially Call of Duty. I was keen to see how the story would end. The questions left unanswered by Tools of Destruction kept me invested. Who are the Sony? What is Clank's greater purpose? What happened to Ratchet's family and the rest of the Lombaxes? At the time, it really did look like this was going to be the last Ratchet and Clank title, and the marketing did place some emphasis on that. If there's one word to describe A Crack in Time, it's refined. Insomniac took a lot of lessons from the previous two games and created one of the best and most fully featured entries in the franchise. For the first time, we start from Clank's perspective. Just where in the universe is he? The answer comes straight away with the Great Clock, a vast contraption that balances the very fabric of existence. Dr. Nefarious, desiring its power for himself, quickly betrays the Sony and things go haywire. Opening with the chaos at the clock does multiple things at once. It showcases the continued excellence in 3D animation, creates an inciting incident that hangs over the entire story, and allows players to ease themselves in with a simple escape scene. Heading into the hostile Breakers sector of the Polaris galaxy, Ratchet, with Captain Quark tagging along, crash land from a time anomaly on planet Quantos. Battling alongside Quark is a good novelty, but you'll be paying more attention to the game's altered art style and a set of defined alien races. You'll quickly notice that A Crack in Time injects some fantasy elements into the mix, expanding on the Sony in the first PS3 release, and this goes hand in hand with the archetypes of school nerds, sport jocks, and those in between. The Fongoids are the first to be encountered, and their goofy voices can get rather grating.
Vanessa, what are you doing out here?
The Xiphoids are back. There must be something wrong with the Timekeeper.
Not in front of the outsiders. Quickly, we must head into the village.
They hold a close connection to the Sony, but lack the hardware to defend themselves. Ratchet and Quark are taken to their temple in the early going, and the player collects a device that can capture the Sony, who have been scattered across the galaxy. There are 40 of them to find, and as the settlement is attacked by Lord Vorsalon, a lieutenant of Dr. Nefarious, the sci-fi element also enters the scene. Here we see a more active set piece. As you fight your way through the onslaught, many of the Fongoids get abducted, which then transitions to a rescue mission on board Vorsalon's flagship. Already, A Crack in Time has a more concise and consistent approach to world building. Further down the line we have the Agorians, a band of muscle-bound warriors who love to pick on and raid others, alongside the Pterachnoids, a highly intelligent species who design many inventions but suck at direct combat. Mixed in with these aliens are the Vullards, clanking engineers who constantly carry space junk on their backs. Each of these aliens are distinctive enough to set the planets apart. Despite the reduced species count, the Polaris galaxy is able to carve out its own identity in this game. The same also holds true for the graphical presentation. Insomniac was able to build on top of the firm base established by Tools of Destruction, with story cutscenes being the biggest highlight. Simple changes like having Ratchet remove his armor and helmet in these moments allow the brilliant facial expressions to shine through. In keeping with their alien inhabitants, the planets are also a great match. Early on, the Vullard planet of Tauren 4 is a rusted and run-down waste, piled high with space junk and forgotten trinkets. This aesthetic mirrors the key character Ratchet is about to discover. When you do leave each of these locations, the title is further enhanced by the new semi-open world spaceflight levels. After fixing Aphelion with the Sony, Ratchet is let loose in different sectors across the galaxy. Landing on planets is as simple as flying close to them, and there are also multiple moons and opportunities to earn bolts along the way. Earlier, I said that these rely on 2D planes rather than full freedom of movement, but when you see their components adding to both story and gameplay, they become a well-oiled piece of the package. On a base level, you'll fly around shooting up enemies and taking down searchlights from Dr. Nefarious alongside the occasional boss fight. This doesn't require much skill, as holding down the trigger while dodging around space mines will bring an easy victory. Despite the combat being fairly simplistic, every other activity has a useful benefit. Towing a stranded Vullard to the nearest fuel depot will get you some bolts towards your next purchase. Completing a moon platforming challenge will reward you with a gold bolt, a Sony to catch for ship upgrades, or a constructor weapon mod for extra customization. On top of all that, the moons complement Ratchet's inventory, from hoverboot courses to killing a certain number of enemies. When compared to the muddled, underdeveloped features of Tools of Destruction, the space sections are a much better fit. You even get simple readings for completion whenever you fly close to each individual area. These go hand in hand with the new Clank levels, which introduce a highly unique and innovative gameplay style: time puzzles. Standing on up to 4 temporal recording pads, Clank can record his actions like stepping on a switch, leaping over a platform, or defeating enemies, then stack additional actions on top. Your goal is to get through the door at the end, which is often complicated by various switches, sealed pressure pads, and elevators. It's a test of both memory and multitasking, as you'll often have to re-record multiple actions from a single pad. You can use a hint system if you want, but you'll also forfeit the bolt reward at the end. The only problem is that the game begs for a couple more of these engaging brain teasers. For completionists, there are some more advanced rooms for gold bolts, but once Clank is found by Ratchet later in the game, his sections come to an end, never to return for the rest of the series. Another element is the management of time anomalies on various planets. It's a basic minigame where you shoot up targets with the chronoscepter before the timer runs out. On occasion, fixing a time anomaly at one location will allow Ratchet to return there and pick up any missing secrets, such as this one on Tauren 4. Ironically, separating our two leading characters works to the game's benefit. Whenever Ratchet transitions to a new space sector, we cut back to Clank and move his story forward. This happens several times as the robot gradually learns the truth about his creation. On that note, let's talk about the plot. The kid-friendly writing still churns out some real clunkers at times.
Okay, anybody need to use the bathroom? I don't want to leave the loading bay and then hear one of you has to go.
But when it comes to both answers and finality, A Crack in Time delivers where it counts. Whenever the game focuses on Quark, the various alien races, and their individual conflicts, the story swings between mediocre and passable. But when we cut back to Ratchet and Clank and their individual journeys, the development rises significantly. It does this with a small handful of new characters who fit well into the narrative, while also revealing many answers to previous questions. Early on, Ratchet meets Alistair Azimuth, a fellow Lombax who knew his father, Caden. Right from the get-go, he makes his presence felt in two ways, showing off his combat skills in a short chase sequence, then teaching the protagonist how to use the new hoverboots. This platforming element is a ton of fun, being used to both blast through platforming challenges and make your way around the environment more quickly. The older Lombax is pleased to engage with one of his own kind after so long, but some personal tensions remain. Azimuth is by far the most interesting character of the entire PS3 lineup for me. He's a tortured soul, ashamed of the mistakes he made and desperate for any means to correct them. Before entering Krell Canyon, he reveals the truth. Years earlier, when Ratchet was an infant, Alistair was a high-ranking member of the Lombax Praetorian Guard. When Percival Tachyon came of age after the Lombaxes raised him, Alistair bought into the villain's proposition for high-tech weapons and other technology. Of course, Tachyon then used the marsupials' own knowledge against them, annihilating most of the species on planet Fastoon, while the survivors fled to an unknown dimension. Ratchet was left behind and eventually taken to Veldin, kicking off the events of the original game, while Azimuth was sent into exile as punishment. This compact cutscene is what every fan had been waiting for since 2007. Say what you will about Ratchet and Clank becoming the chosen ones rather than everyman characters, but this reveal is very well done, with strong voice acting from James Arnold Taylor and Joey Doria. Arriving at the game's halfway mark, it sets up the choice Ratchet has to make, which then collides with Clank's duties at the Great Clock. When aboard this grand contraption, it's all about Clank's father Orvus, the previous caretaker of the clock, who planted Clank's soul in the Solana galaxy. Together with the assistant Sigmund at his side, the robot ventures into his consciousness, learning more about the Great Clock and the immense danger of using it improperly. Each of these segments are effectively training courses in both platforming and the light combat elements that pop up from time to time. It's all very basic stuff. Clank swings his chronoscepter and tosses a time bomb to slow enemies down, making them easy pickings. He can also deflect projectiles back at turrets and flying enemies. Clank and Sigmund make their way across the clock, repairing various items and testing out the chambers, eventually culminating in the centralized Orvus chamber, the most crucial piece of the entire contraption. Before that, however, the player learned that Orvus left the clock some time ago and never returned. This places us back into Ratchet's perspective. Even when the duo are separated, the way their two plot threads connect results in some solid set pieces. Take planet Xanathar, Orvus's last known location. After reaching out to his pal, Ratchet journeys there in a bid to save Clank's father, discovering an icy hellscape ruled over by Dr. Nefarious and turned into a refinery. A time portal is created, allowing Ratchet to view the fungoid settlement that existed before the takeover. You can see that the species came down with an unfortunate case of brainwashing, and once you sneak into the villain's tower, you'll find Orvus imprisoned and undergoing some painful interrogation before dying. This is when the two narrative threads cross with each other, slowly bringing the duo back together. The story gaps are also filled in for Dr. Nefarious. After many years of drifting through space, him and Lawrence crash-landed on the planet. They manipulated their way into the Fungoid's good books and eventually found out about the Great Clock, which they plan to use and twist the current timeline to their evil liking. On the ground, the cross between shooting and platforming is about the same as Tools of Destruction, with the biggest addition being the more wide-open levels. In gameplay, you'll do more than just shoot your way through a linear gauntlet. Planet Terracnos features a great use of the hover boots and a showdown with the VX-99 that blends platforming and shooting, but the finest example of this design is Krell Canyon. To locate the Obsidian Eye and contact Clank, Ratchet and Azimuth must first help the Vullards fend off an Agorian invasion. Throughout the valley are 5 key targets to eliminate, and you can tackle these in any order you choose, while also doing some light exploring on the upper levels for collectibles. This is then followed up by a brief turret sequence and an exploration of the local mines with a new enemy type. The Tetramites are a swarm of insects based on a similar foe from Resistance 2. To keep them at bay, you'll use the new Omni Soaker to plant both honey and water to work your way through. This set of objectives goes right down the middle, striking a good balance between open and narrow scenarios. Many of the weapons take traditional archetypes and mix them in with some sci-fi pastiche. The Sonic Eruptor is a crowd-controlling shotgun, but it's also an alien creature that belches stronger blasts when you pull the trigger in time with its breathing. The Plasma Striker is much like the Flux Rifle, but you can also do critical damage by shooting weak points on enemies. Returning devices like the Groovitron and Mr. Zircon have been lumped in with the regular weapons. There's no longer a need to collect special ammunition, and they can also be upgraded through regular use. No matter which weapon you purchase, you'll receive a neat video guide on its functionality and how to use it, another great touch from Insomniac. One of the best weapons by far comes late in the game, the Rift Inducer 5000. Sure, it looks like a puny sonic screwdriver at first glance, but it summons an alien abomination that devours all nearby enemies. The RYNO 5 is once again a buildable weapon, boasting a chain gun, chunky rocket launcher, and a theme tune courtesy of the classical Russian piece 1812 Overture. It inches out the 4th RYNO in terms of usability, even if the rounds still don't shoot completely straight. This seems to be a common means of balancing out the screen nuke, high power but reduced accuracy. That brings us to the Constructo pistol, Constructo bomb glove, and Constructo shotgun, which rework the customizable elements seen in Ratchet Gladiator. Mixing and matching various parts allows you to change their functionality. The starting pistol can be turned into a charged ray gun, the bomb glove can spark energized waves, and the shotgun can be tailored for either crowd control or a more narrow, powerful punch. By scattering weapon mods across the game, you're encouraged to both explore and experiment with all 3 weapons, even tailoring them to specific situations wherever you see fit. I would have liked to see a Constructo sniper or rocket launcher, but what we get adds another layer to an already strong arsenal. Much like Ratchet and Clank 2 before it, it's baffling that these guns didn't become regular fixtures in the series. Future games would heavily limit the customizable elements. In between the main levels, we also have another arena mode aboard the Agorian Battleplex. This is much more fleshed out than Tools of Destruction, with 2 full tournaments and plenty of unlockable items. The Spiral of Death, a fan-made weapon, and the Chimpo-matic are the biggest prizes here. One random addition was My Blaster Runs Hot, a basic arcade minigame that serves a minor distraction. It took me many attempts to crack 10,000 points and snag the last PS3 trophies for the title. Even the Insomniac Museum made a comeback, offering a fitting reward for players who collected all the Zoni and beat Lord Vorsalon a 3rd time. Going back to presentation, A Crack in Time condenses the soundtrack down a bit. Some galactic radio stations complement your commute from one location to the next, and the unique tracks for each planet remain, but a greater emphasis is placed on heroic pieces that match the galaxy-ending stakes. Admittedly, there are some plot holes as A Crack in Time heads into the final act, mostly based on Clank's distance from the Great Clock. When Lawrence followed him into the Orvis chamber and knocked him out, why did Lawrence just leave Sigmund unharmed rather than tossing him into a scrap compressor? What happened to all the time anomalies while the clock was left without caretakers? The villains seem to stop in their tracks as we pivot to rescuing Clank from the Valkyries on planet Vipedia. It's a well-made encounter, combining a hoverboot section with plenty of combat against the returning robots. Taking on Cassiopeia marks the end of the 2nd act, and Clank finally hopping on Ratchet's back once again. It's a bit of a shame that the duo's reunion doesn't translate into more inventive platforming sequences. Insomniac could have combined the hoverboots with Clank's helipack for some high-flying action. Instead, the player is able to use time bombs against regular enemies, which I barely did for the remainder of the title. It's all about stopping Dr. Nefarious and infiltrating his space station at this point, with Quark lending a hand through his Nurse Shannon disguise. One reference to the Star Wars trash compactor later, and you're fighting your way to the bridge. Ratchet also disguises himself as Nefarious at one point, which offers a capably amusing set of commands. It is just as basic as the pirate disguise in the previous entry, but packs a bit more personality. The escape doesn't go as planned, as the trio are once again captured despite their arsenal, and fired out of a cannon to the ruined world of Morklon. Gimlick Valley was raided years earlier by the Agorians, who flooded the settlement and reduced the fungoid population to a few desperate souls. To escape the planet, we once again go back in time to change the outcome of the battle. Taking on an Agorian general in his starfighter results in another boss fight, and a crappy line to go along with it. This does raise the question, couldn't Azimuth use the same time portals to go back to Fastoon and change the events of that battle? The game doesn't touch on this again once Morklon is converted to a happier, more peaceful place. I wonder if Insomniac could have explained this better. Rather than dwelling on the details, we head straight back to the Nefarious space station for a shorter lead-up. Quark somehow escaped and is now tearing things up with his pet Wargrok in another obvious plot hole. The ultimate confrontation with Dr. Nefarious is quite the spectacle, and arguably just as good as his appearance in Ratchet and Clank 3. Things start off simple as the villain hovers above, his massive station looming in the background, but then the second stage kicks into high gear. You'll use the hover boots to dodge a death laser, leaping your way across the station wreckage and onto the final UFO. The third stage throws Lawrence into the mix as you chew away at Nefarious's health bar. The villain is put down for the count, Lawrence does a runner in the escape pod, and Ratchet and Clank are saved in the nick of time by Azimuth as the space station is destroyed. This should have killed the Mad Doctor 10 times over, but the developer would bring him back again, mostly due to fan popularity. Upon returning to the Great Clock, Ratchet trusts Clank completely. Knowing the device can never be used to save the Lombaxes, our protagonists agree to part ways. Enraged over the abandonment of his race, Alistair suddenly snaps and kills Ratchet with his staff. We've seen this kind of twist before. It is very abrupt, but unlike another well-known platforming mascot, we've seen the build-up and understand why the old Lombax is so hell-bent on using the Great Clock for his own ends. Clank is able to rewind time by 6 minutes to save his friend, and the finale of the future trilogy comes to fruition. Fighting Azimuth as the Orvis chamber falls apart around you makes for a solid climax. This is further enhanced by the dialogue between the two Lombaxes, which emphasises the battle between personal and galactic stakes. Alistair's 180 at the end of the fight happens very quickly, but his final act prevents the fabric of existence from being ripped open. It all feels much more personal than another showdown with a basic villain. Ratchet turns to go, but Clank refuses to leave him until he finds his own family. I've always appreciated how the final cutscene is scripted. As Sigmund takes over as caretaker and he listens to the final message from Orvis, we find out that Clank is doing exactly what his father wanted, doing what makes him feel whole. The duo jets off into parts unknown, a definitive conclusion to the PS3 titles. With a more committed design template and other improvements, I now consider A Crack in Time to be the best entry on the 7th console generation. From here, Ratchet and Clank would head off in other directions, gradually moving away from what I loved about the series. The next entry was a spin-off, Ratchet and Clank All For One. When I watched the reveal trailer, my thoughts quickly turned from excitement to disappointment. A run-of-the-mill party game that forgoes any semblance of 3D platforming? No thanks. In the years following, another release, Ratchet & Clank 4 Frontal Assault, known as Q-Force in the UK, would also arrive, but I didn't pay much attention to it. By the time the next mainline entry arrived, I was taking a break from regular gaming. As a franchise, Ratchet & Clank's mainline entries hadn't ended completely, but I was still surprised to hear that Insomniac was putting together an epilogue of sorts. Into the Nexus, another smaller scale release, was the final effort on PS3. In terms of scale, it is slightly larger than Quest for Booty, and packs in some extra content not seen in that title. Arriving in November 2013 as a downloadable and physical release, this one, like the two spin-offs before it, completely passed me by. I was getting into my first year of uni back then, and had no time for the series. This retrospective marks my first playthrough, and the 8th mainline entry falls somewhere in the middle. Neither the best nor the weakest, just an easygoing romp that stays the course. After saving the Great Clock, Ratchet and Clank have reconnected with Talwyn, Kronk and Zephyr and joined the Polaris Defense Force. Into the Nexus opens with the group transporting the galactic criminal Vendra Prog. It doesn't go to plan as their cruiser, the Nebulox, is quickly attacked by her brother Neftin and the returning Thugs for Less. As soon as the action started, I noticed something off with the frame rate. Previous titles had all been silky smooth, allowing the combat to move fluidly. Utilising an updated PS3 game engine, Into the Nexus feels slower, even a bit cumbersome at first. Much like A Crack in Time before it, this entry slightly alters the art style, but this time the overall performance is affected. This also influences enemy attacks, as the gap between an enemy making a melee swing and hitting Ratchet is extremely short. It's that awkward transition between console generations. Ratchet & Clank PS4 performs far better from a technical standpoint. When it comes to gameplay, Into the Nexus acts as a crossing over point as well. This shows through the changes to both control and some features that would reappear in the next entry. Lock strafing, a regular fixture since 2003, is gone, replaced with an aim button. Hold down L1 and the game plays like a typical third-person shooter, with a target reticule that changes slightly depending on which weapon you're using. This altered system quickly comes into play with gravity jumping. Aim at a magnetic surface, hit X, and Ratchet will leap to it automatically. This quickly comes into play as you traverse the exterior of the cruiser, which eventually leads to a chase sequence involving an enemy fighter. Kronk and Zephyr are both blown up in the ensuing chaos, and our duo stows away on board an enemy vessel to escape. What follows is exactly what you've come to expect from the series. After the world-ending stakes of its predecessor, Into the Nexus takes things down a notch. This is a smaller tale with a minimised set of characters and a handful of themes that return from the future trilogy, control and the misunderstanding of greater forces being the biggest. There isn't much in the way of character arcs here, and the main story inevitably falls flat. Killing off Kronk and Zephyr in the opening level would have had more weight if they were memorable as characters, and the game's short length means that new cast members don't have much time to develop. This is most evident with the villains. Vendra and Neftin are very underwhelming. Their motive involves pulling minions from a realm known as the Neververse, much like Tachyon at the start of the PS3 saga. In the early going, we do have a visit to the Miro orphanage, which delivers a light dose of backstory for the two siblings, but that's where the detail ends. Starting with the standard issue Omni Blaster and Fusion Grenade, Into the Nexus often places you into narrow corridors or arenas, leaving the weapon selection to pick up the slack. Luckily, the weapons and their functionality still rise to the challenge. The Temporal Repulsor is an energy shotgun that suspends foes in mid-air, and the Nightmare Box is a reworked version of the Decoy Glove. Shoot one out and the enemies will be briefly paralysed with fear before shooting it, allowing you to lay on your own firepower. The Neverblades combine the Buzz Blades and the Spiral of Death with a purple hue, and the Winterizer turns enemies into harmless snowmen. To match the game's scale, each weapon can be upgraded to Mark III only, and the upgrade system has also been edited. Raritanium continues to be applied to multiple upgrade slots, and circling around the question marks will unlock special abilities. It's a simple evolution of previous mechanics that keeps you on the lookout for the crystallized element. Platforming gadgets are also simple. The one major addition is the Grav Tether, which allows the duo to float across gaps, switching directions as they go. We also have a jetpack for the first time in the series, allowing Ratchet and Clank to fly and shoot at the same time. The device functions on a fuel meter, which is easily refilled by standing on nearby pads. You won't find any levels as open as Sargasso here, as most of the flying is done on planet Silox, escaping from rising floodwaters. The jetpack could have been better utilised, providing more variety to the platforming, but instead it mostly boils down to the bare minimum. Once again, it's the Clank sections that form the biggest departure. Having given away his Chronoscepter, the little robot is now fitted with an interdimensional device called the Rift Cracker, allowing him to enter 2D gravity-shifting sections. Any fans of the platforming genre will immediately point to Super Mario Galaxy 2 and other contemporaries, but they still make for a nice change of pace. Adjusting gravity to shift walls and platforms while moving around hazards, you make your way to a purple spirit beast, then lead it back to the entrance portal to kill it and open the way for Ratchet. With good checkpoints and a quick pace, these sequences may not be original, but they're still fun. Moving beyond the basic setup of Quest for Booty, Into the Nexus features a small selection of returning minigames. It's not quite Ratchet & Clank 2 levels of variation, but they do provide some light replayability. Arena combat in Destructopalooza has clearly been scaled back in terms of size and production values, with a very standard collection of challenges. You've seen these many times before: finish multiple rounds, defeat the enemies under a time limit, win without taking a single hit. It's too bad there aren't many inventive scenarios. Aside from the occasional boss fight taking place on hovering platforms and jetpack flying, you won't have much trouble beating them. Winning some bolts and the occasional item will tide you over for a little while, before quickly heading back to the main story. On the other side of the coin, we have another returning gadget, Ratchet's hover boots, which the returning smuggler just so happens to be selling on planet Fram. This time around it's a case of holding down R2 to blast forward, but the functionality is limited. Platforming courses have also been simplified, and you'll mostly use the boots to get around the environments more quickly. Contrivances aside, it's surprising to see crystal hunting make an appearance in this smaller scale release. Again, the environment feels more narrow, connected mainly by ramps and jump pads. You'll shoot through the local wildlife in no time, with extra bolt rewards afterwards. Ultimately, it's a necessary add-on, as the bolt economy will price you out of some weapons by the end of the game. The Nether Beast and Warmonger were particularly expensive, and I skipped over both of them in the lead up to the last levels. Luckily, the return to planet Igliak is a memorable one, at least for a portion. After beating Neftin into submission on planet Silox, the mechanized gorilla comes to his senses and works with Ratchet and Clank to help his sister see the error of her ways. This quick turnaround eventually leads us back to the capital of Polaris. You'll start by battling your way through the city and taking on multiple mini-boss creatures in another open level design. Admittedly, this isn't as varied or well layered as Krell Canyon, with a set of samey circular arenas. Afterwards, Ratchet and Clank make their way to the Museum of Galactic History, and what follows is pure fan service. Basic lock and key puzzles aside, working your way through is a very enjoyable activity, leaping around and dodging blasts from the Bio-Obliterator, hopping over a statue of a Sargasso Troglosaur, and listening to audio logs for characters past and present. All of it is a great tribute to the series, and shows how far Ratchet and Clank have come over the last decade. The museum level segues into the final boss, an interdimensional monstrosity called Mr. I, who manipulated Vendra and Neftin into releasing him. Without much build-up or development, this antagonist doesn't make much of an impression, and the fight itself is incredibly basic. Hop across the platforms, then lay on the firepower. The most annoying part comes in the final moments when the game starts spamming regular enemies at you on a tiny platform. It feels unbalanced, like you have to keep shooting the main target and hope that he dies before you do. The game offers you a restart if you need to go back and grind out more weapon upgrades. With enough perseverance, Mr. I is beaten, Vendra and her brother return to prison, and Ratchet and Clank are left with a bit of a dilemma. What to do with the remaining Dimensionator? Could it be used to finally locate the Lombaxes? It would take 8 years before that question would finally be answered. With a total of 4 mainline releases alongside a couple of spin-offs, the PlayStation 3 played host to more Ratchet & Clank adventures than any other console. Insomniac took the opportunity to propel gaming animation to new heights and successfully continued their biggest IP in the process. Not every fan was pleased with the direction the series took, but it remained a major powerhouse in the Sony pantheon. For the next PlayStation, the developer would take a simpler route, only putting out a single, rather divisive entry. As we went further into the 2010s, Insomniac would diversify its portfolio, releasing titles like Sunset Overdrive for the Xbox One and the multi-platform release Fuse under EA. Neither of these games would perform as well commercially, and Insomniac quickly found their way back to Sony. In a major contrast with previous generations, the developer only released one Ratchet & Clank game for the PlayStation 4. It's fitting that we end right where we started, circling back around to a reimagining of the first Ratchet & Clank. It also coincided with an animated movie of the same name, directed by Kevin Munro and distributed by Focus Features. Despite previous comparisons with Pixar and a cast with names like John Goodman and Sylvester Stallone, the film bombed both critically and commercially. Bringing the duo to the silver screen wasn't a recipe for success, a bad omen that seemingly bled over into the game itself. I got my first hands-on with Ratchet & Clank PS4 at, of all places, Fan Expo 2015 in Toronto, Canada. The playable demo showed a simple fight with the Blargian Snagglebeast, and played well enough, but of course this was only a small piece of the package. When the title finally arrived in April 2016, many players weren't too impressed with it, despite mostly positive reviews. The fanbase has a lot of disdain for this game, and the blowback is best summed up by the Gaming Brit Show and his video, How Ratchet Lost Its Edge. After playing from start to finish myself for the first time, I agree with him wholeheartedly on the story and writing. Taking place from Captain Quark's perspective, the disgraced celebrity is banged up in a high-security prison, telling his version of events to another galactic criminal. I recommend taking note of this creative choice, as it ends up becoming a major crutch for the story to lean on. Retelling the story of how Ratchet & Clank first met, Quark narrates much of the adventure, constantly commenting on various gameplay sections, beginning once again with Planet Veldin. In this reworked tale, Ratchet is an assistant to Grimroth Raz, one of many pointless characters across the narrative. When the Galactic Rangers come looking for new recruits, the happy-go-lucky hero excitedly rushes to complete their training course, eager to join up. Being an elitist celebrity only in it for fame and riches, Quark rejects him on the spot. Right from the start, there's one word to describe the story: generic. Much of the franchise's identity has been stripped away and the characters reduced to simplistic archetypes. Meanwhile, Clank pops up at random off an assembly line on planet Quartu, and we get to play through his escape sequence rather than watching an opening cutscene. This had some potential, but it quickly fades as a basic chase scene from the PlayStation 1 era enters the scene. Victor Von Iron, Chairman Drek's second-in-command, chases him through the factory, with Clank simply jumping over his highly telegraphed attacks. Graphically, it looks brilliant with the corridor lights reflecting off the two robots so seamlessly, but the gameplay is the most basic it has ever been. This sets the stage for the rest of the title, and as the campaign begins, you'll notice many detrimental changes that don't add anything to the experience. Ratchet and Clank meet for the first time in a similar manner to the original, and the two set out to prove themselves on a galactic scale. Of course, the game will make sure you remember this from start to finish. As many other players have pointed out, no one in Ratchet and Clank 2016 ever shuts up. This inane approach also extends to the many design choices that make the game more casual. Even on hard mode, numerous button prompts are constantly popping up. Press square to whack the mine off the grind rail, press R1 to hover over the gap, press square to pick up the bomb. For younger players, this can be a helpful way to get them into the action, but for anyone who has followed the franchise since the beginning, it all feels incredibly patronising, and that's the complete opposite of how Ratchet and Clank started out. On both an audio and visual level, the game feels very cluttered to the point that voice lines interrupt each other during gameplay. Add to that the cinematic borders in each major cutscene, and you quickly understand the chosen direction. Ratchet and Clank 2016 aspires to be a simple kids film that you can play through, but it's not a very good one, chock full of cringeworthy lines, forced modern humour, and weak characterization. Young children will eat up the vibrant colours and cartoony action without much fuss, but everyone else will be left disappointed. While the story quickly flounders in the early going, you'll still be very impressed by the technicals. Insomniac put together another new game engine for Ratchet and Clank PS4, one that would be used in Spider-Man 2 years later. Every building, planetoid and enemy is richly detailed, providing another great backdrop to the action. The levels may not always hit the mark, but the developer continued to put out some of the best visuals on the platform. Though when you pair these efforts up with gameplay, things get a bit messy. The soundtrack is relatively basic and uninspired. Like much of the title, it aims to be more cinematic, but in doing so it removes much of the franchise's identity for unique worlds and scenarios. When you get down to blasting enemies, a key issue emerges. The combat often feels too chaotic, with tons of dazzling effects obscuring the enemy projectiles. The deeper you get into the title, the more pronounced the problem becomes. As the enemy numbers ramp up and more flashing lights fill the screen, it can be difficult to make out when to dodge and when to swap to a specific weapon. For the first time in the series, the presentation has overcome the core gameplay, something every previous entry avoided. Other gaps in the technical details include some awkward death animations and more pronounced knockback. These idiosyncrasies stand out because other titles were very consistent for the most part. They awkwardly interrupt any immersive elements the planets have, and on occasion cause an unfair death. In-game cutscenes are also very subpar, relying heavily on bland facial expressions and simple camera angles to explain mission objectives. In the early going, you'll see many familiar sights, the first being Metropolis Kerwin, now renamed Alero City. The place doesn't make a good first impression, as the opening spaceflight sequence is both basic and limited. You're locked inside a defined area, pushed towards a single boss fight against a cruiser. Outside of picking up enemies using a gravity tether and hurling them at the vessel, this sequence comes nowhere close to its predecessors, despite being delivered in full 3D. Even with the shiny graphics engine, Metropolis feels smaller and less memorable in 2016. The buildings are more spaced out, and many former pathways have been cut off in favour of a linear design. For example, the fitness course is now connected to the Galactic Ranger headquarters right at the end of the level for story purposes. Much like the recent Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy VII Remake, much of Ratchet and Clank has undergone change. The aforementioned Snagglebeast has been moved to the Blarg station, and in a lazy move, it uses the same animations and attacks as the Wargrok from A Crack in Time. The Clank section, this time to collect the Magna Boots and tunnels with numerous alien creatures, have stayed the same, though you won't be fighting a Queen alien or picking up the Grind Boots in this version. Blackwater City remains largely unchanged, though the RYNO salesman has been moved to the top of the city where Captain Quark's trailer used to be. Across these and other locations, trespasser puzzles and hoverboard racing have returned, with some notable changes. When it comes to unlocking doors, players have the option of bypassing the puzzles, though you'll forfeit both the Bolt reward and the PS4 trophy in the process. Hoverboard racing feels more pedestrian due to the effort made to simplify the gameplay. Crashing and falling behind the competition is much less frequent here, as you're constantly given turbo boosts from breaking crates and performing tricks in mid-air. The race announcer constantly chimes in on your every move as well. For the weapons, it's a mixture of old and new from across the series, heavily leaning towards the former. The Glove of Doom, Pyrocitor and Sheepinator all return from the PS2 originals, alongside the Combustor, Groovitron and Mr. Zircon from Tools of Destruction, Plasma Striker from A Crack in Time, and Warmonger from Into the Nexus. All of these returning firearms fulfill their original functions and are all very intuitive to use. The newer weapons come with their own useful functions. The Proton Drum is a great crowd controlling device, sending out energized waves that sync up to the DualShock 4's vibration, and the Pixelizer pairs up a powerful shotgun with a zany 8-bit effect. All weapons utilize the Raritanium upgrade tree system and can be leveled up to rank 5. The RYNO closely resembles the one seen in A Crack in Time, but its accuracy has been tightened up a bit. Like the future saga before it, you'll collect a set of items to build the weapon, which we'll get to later. What's unfortunate about all these armaments is how the game constantly reminds you to buy them from the Gadgetron vendors. It's a senseless addition that assumes players aren't keeping track of their bulk count. Ratchet and Clank 2016 is shorter than other mainline releases, but slightly longer than Into the Nexus. Those who played the 2002 version will quickly notice the many alterations made to the campaign, especially with the planets and their overall layout. Battalia has been converted into a snow planet with a straightforward path to the turret sequence, while other locations have been phased into each other or completely redone, most notably Planet Quartu, which has been converted into a linear factory gauntlet with sections for both Ratchet and Clank. After disabling the security systems as Clank, we have a gradual ascent to the top along the assembly lines. The jetpack from Into the Nexus is used in a boss fight with Mrs. Zircon, who launches both drones and several projectiles towards you. Surprisingly, I found this battle more difficult than the final boss, as the factory has less room to dodge. Planet Gaspar has received the biggest expansion, with a jetpack brain hunting section. Thanks to full freedom of movement, the new addition is a welcome one. Flying around, taking on giant squids, and finding the occasional secret area is perhaps the best part of the entire experience, as it is mostly disconnected from the central plot. Cut planets from across the 2002 game include Eudora, Umbris, Auxon, Hoven, Gemlik Base, and Altanis. This also means that giant Clank sections are out, along with Hydropack gauntlets and other space fighter sequences. Despite these changes, Ratchet & Clank 2016 still commits to replayability through the returning gold bolts, which are used to unlock various gameplay modifiers and different sections of the Insomniac Museum once you beat the game. This iteration is more of a franchise tribute than a level to mess around in, mainly featuring memorabilia from multiple entries. The biggest new addition are the holodeck cards, another collection of references to titles both past and present. Defeating specific enemies or hunting around the environment will allow you to complete various card sets, which then provide some light changes like increased Bolt and Raritanium earnings. 5 duplicate cards can be traded to improve your completion rate, and there are also 9 cards for the RYNO to collect. Rounding off the design template, the Clank sections fall somewhere in the middle, Picking up gadgetbots and working through simple obstacle courses is far better than running from Chairman Drek's attack dog. Rather than commanding a group of robots, you'll convert their functions to spring, bridge or power modes, which correspond to the various gizmos around the levels. The challenge of the puzzles comes from pulling the group together, then powering up a generator with the correct number of gadgetbots. This brain teaser on board the Starship Phoenix involves moving the bots around a rotating platform to activate the pump system. These moments are fairly infrequent, but they continue to offer a worthy gameplay alternative. All the way through, the story doesn't get much better. The awkward pacing and strange twists and turns are beholden to both the kid-friendly focus and attempting to pay tribute to the series. It seems the developer threw so many elements in as a nod to past entries, rather than making sense in the overall plot. Being shackled to the feature film has severely damaged the story and pacing. The one saving grace of this weak narrative is how Captain Quark tells it. We've seen this character from the original, watched him sit back while others do all the work and steal all the glory for himself. It's well within his character to exaggerate and bend the truth. Even with this element in place, however, it can't excuse much of the weak writing on display. I've always thought that the best family-friendly productions balance out the material for both children and adults. When you take that away, you're left with a shallow tale that will become outdated very quickly. After Planet Quartu, things come to a head as the Galactic Rangers assault the Deplanetizer. Ratchet and Clank split up, with the former shooting at the enemy in a space battle, and the latter staying on board the Starship Phoenix. Here he comes face to face with Victor Von Iron once again. This bulky robot is easily the lamest and most pathetic villain in the franchise's history. He shows up twice, chases Clank in 2 outdated sequences, and dies in the most pitiful way possible without a direct boss fight. He replaces Captain Quark in the space battle, but goes down very easily. Indeed, that goes for every villain in the game. Chairman Drek is voiced by Paul Giamatti, and he's such an unthreatening non-presence throughout. When he captures Ratchet with the magnet launcher and chucks him out the airlock rather than executing him, you know that logic has been sacrificed completely. After the destruction of planet Novalis, Ratchet gives up and returns to Veldin for pretty much no reason. It's a very forced second act break that didn't receive any build-up or payoff. Like many other moments, it's quickly tossed aside as Clank convinces his friend to keep on fighting. It pales in comparison to their growing bond in the original. The Gadgetron headquarters on Kalibo 3 is now the penultimate planet. Unlike other locations, the upgrades to the visuals really show off the graphical leap from PS2 to PS4. You'll fight your way through nefarious troopers this time, which culminates in a tough fight on the final bridge. The sheer amount of laser blasts coming at you is best handled from downrange, before crossing to the final Gadgetron arena. Unfortunately, we're treated to yet another slice of terrible writing, perhaps the worst in the entire franchise. Some of you already know what it is.
The kids love their social medias. #Gadgetron.
After that atrocious line, we have the second hoverboard race to obtain the Hologuise, which is again much more forgiving. All you have to do is nail the second tunnel shortcut, and you'll win all 3 races without any trouble. Returning to the Deplanetizer under enhanced security, a tweaked stealth section comes in. This is also somewhere in the middle. It's not as basic as the Holo Pirate disguise, but also not as engaging as the original game. Sneaking through as Captain Quark adds a bit of light humour to the proceedings before you finally make it to the centre. First up to the plate is Captain Quark, in a throwback to Ratchet and Clank 3. What makes this fight somewhat interesting is how he uses the duo's own weapons against them. That hasn't been done in the series before, and having to break Ratchet out of a forced Groovatron dance switches things up a bit. However, Quark's abrupt 180 at the end is very poorly done. Saying "I'm sorry" is no way to transition to the final boss or tie off his supposed character arc. It makes his motivations and place in the story completely trivial. This is Ratchet and Clank 2016 in a nutshell, a set of mildly entertaining gameplay segments sandwiched against a pitiful story. This same banality also holds true with Dr. Nefarious, who dumps Chairman Drek out of the story and takes his place in the final battle. It comes out of nowhere for senseless reasons, and yet again we have a character who has no reason to be in this game. Dr. Nefarious is only there because the fans recognise him. The ensuing climax looks great, but it isn't much different from the Mrs. Zircon fight. Flying around and keeping your finger on the trigger will quickly deplete the villain's health bar. Ratchet, Clank and Captain Quark escape the exploding deplanetizer in the nick of time, and the traitorous superhero turns himself into the authorities, bringing us back to the game's opening. Returning to Planet Kerwin, Ratchet and Clank are honoured as heroes, as the cliché of quickly heading back into action rears its head. Our protagonists and Quark, seemingly forgiven on a whim, give chase, and the title ends on a thoroughly lacklustre note. For a game that sought to commemorate 14 years of Ratchet and Clank, the choices made were very infuriating for long-term fans. It's as if they couldn't decide whether they wanted to make a game for young kids or a franchise tribute, so they chose to do both, and didn't succeed in either goal. We're left with a tepid and ultimately underwhelming experience that alienated much of the fanbase. There's no question that it's one of the best looking and best sounding platformers on the market, but it came with several caveats, making it the first major step backwards for the series. Story isn't everything for this genre, but the many contrivances and the insistence on this altered narrative diminishes the overall impact. Even with this downturn, Ratchet & Clank 2016 would become one of the fastest selling releases in the franchise, topping the UK charts in its first week. For those of you who stuck around to the end of this retrospective, it might seem anticlimactic to end with the weakest entry, but that is where the duo ended up, at least until the franchise jumped console generations for the fourth time in 2021. To many of its biggest supporters, the original Ratchet & Clank is still the gold standard, while others have thoroughly enjoyed the series across all three formats. I moved on from the franchise a long time ago, but it continues to deliver a widespread appeal to many. The duo represents one of the longest running PlayStation exclusives, and for good reason. What's most impressive is how R&C still maintains massive popularity and critical recognition despite not having altered the core formula. You'd think that Insomniac Games would be sick of it at this point, but the furry marsupial and robot backpack have kept going after 2 decades, having never released an outright awful mainline entry. As long as PlayStation exists, so will Ratchet & Clank, and that's the ultimate achievement a gaming franchise can accomplish. Thanks for watching.